Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Wearing my Obama shirt. Don't want to talk too much. I don't even know if this is working right now. Let's just get the show on the road. It's going to be like a 12-hour journey. So if you want to message me, I might check my watch or something. I don't know. Because I'm using my phone as a camera. But I think should be ready to roll. So, got my waters. I'm gonna go on this experience together. It's been a year since the AP exam for history for me. I didn't do that well, so it's time to catch up on my history. Here we go.
Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course U.S. History. No, Stan, that's not going to work, actually. I mean, we're talking about the 16th century today when this was neither united nor states. By the way, this globe reflects the fact that I believe that Alaskan statehood is illegitimate. In fact, we're going to call this whole show U.S. History, but inevitably it's going to involve other parts of the world, and also, not to brag, a small part of the moon. Sorry, we can be a little bit self-aggrandizing sometimes here in America. So to begin U.S. history, we're not going to talk about the United States or this guy. We're going to talk about the people who lived here before any Europeans showed up. North America was home to a great variety of people, so it's difficult to generalize, but here's what we can say. One, when the Europeans arrived, there were no classical-style civilizations with monumental architecture and empires like the Aztec or the Incas. And two, native North Americans had no metalwork, no gunpowder, no wheels, no written languages, and no domesticated animals. However, they did have farming, complex social and political structures, and widespread trade networks. Mr. Green! So they were pretty backwards, huh? Well, I mean, or at least primitive. Primitive is a funny word to me from the past because it implies a romanticization, these simple people who never used more than they needed and had no use for guns, and it also implies an infantilization. It's like you believe that just because you have a beeper and they didn't, they were somehow less evolved humans. But you can't see the human story as one that goes from primitive to civilized. That's not just Eurocentric, that's contemporary-centric. The idea that we're moving forward as a species implies a linear progression that just does not reflect the reality of life on this planet. I get that you like to imagine yourself as the result of millennia of advancement and the very pinnacle of humanness, but from where I'm sitting, that worldview is a lot more backwards than living without the wheel. So no one knows exactly how many people lived in North America before the Europeans got here. Some estimates are as high as 75 million, but in the present U.S. borders, the guesses are between 2 and 10 million. And like other Native Americans, their populations were decimated by diseases such as smallpox and influenza. Actually, it was much worse than decimation. As many of you have pointed out, decimation means 1 in 10. This was much worse than that. It was closer maybe to 8 in 10, which would be an octocimation. So there had been civilizations in North America, but they peaked before the Europeans arrived. The Zuni and Hopi civilization, round about here, peaked about 1200 CE. They had large multiple family dwellings in canyons, which they probably left because of drought. Crash Course world history fans will remember that environmental degradation often causes the decline of civilizations. I'm looking at you, Indus Valley, and also you, entire future Earth. But complex civilizations weren't the rule in North America, and now we're about to begin generalizing. A bad habit historians have, partly because there's a limited historical record, but also because Eurocentric historians have a bad habit of primitivizing and simplifying others. So I want to underscore that there was huge diversity in the pre-Columbus American experience, and that talking about someone who lived here in 1000 BCE and talking about someone who lived here 2000 years later is just inherently problematic. That said, let's go to the thought bubble. Most native groups in most places organized as tribes, and their lives were dominated by the natural resources available where they lived. So West Coast Indians primarily lived by fishing, gathering, and hunting sea mammals. Great Plains Indians were often buffalo hunters. These tribal bands often united into loose confederacies or leagues, the best known of which was probably the Iroquois Confederacy, also called the Great League of Peace. This was kind of like an upstate New York version of NATO, but without nuclear weapons or the incessant international meddling or Latvians. Okay, it was nothing like NATO, actually. Religion usually involved a vibrant spiritual world with ceremonies geared toward the tribe's lifestyle. Hunting tribes focused on animals, agricultural tribes on good harvests, and most Indian groups believed in a single creator god who stood above all the other deities, but they weren't monotheistic in the way that Christians who came to the New World were. American Indians also saw property very differently from Europeans.
I'm bored
To
already.
First Peoples, land was a common resource that village leaders could assign families to use, but not to own, and most land was seen as common to everyone. As Black Hawk, a leader of the Sauk tribe, said, "The Great Spirit gave it to his children to live upon and cultivate as far as necessary for their subsistence, and so long as they occupy and cultivate it, they have a right to the soil." Thanks, Thought Bubble. So many of us tend to romanticize American Indians as being immune from greed and class, but in fact there were class distinctions in Indian tribes. Rulers tended to come from the same families, for instance. That said, wealth was much more evenly distributed than it was in Europe. And while most tribal leaders were men, many tribes were matrilineal, meaning that children became members of their mother's family. Also, women were often important religious leaders. Women also often owned dwellings and tools, although not land, because again, that idea did not exist. Also, in many tribes, women engaging in premarital scoodly pooping wasn't taboo. In general, they were just much less obsessed with female chastity than Europeans were. I mean, I will remind you, the first English settlement in America was called Virginia. The idea that Native Americans were noble savages, somehow purer than Europeans and untouched by their vices, is not a new one. Like, some of the earliest Europeans saw the Indians as paragons of physical beauty and innocent of Europeans' worst characteristics. But for most Europeans, there was little noble about what they saw as pure Indian savagery. I mean, Indians didn't have writing, they suffered from the terrible character flaw of being able to have sex without feeling ashamed, and most importantly, they weren't Christians. The Spanish were the first Europeans to explore this part of the world. Juan Ponce de Leon arrived in what is now Florida in 1513 looking for gold and the fabled Fountain of Youth. In 1521, he encountered a Calusa brave's poison-tipped arrow and died before discovering that the Fountain of Youth is, of course, delicious diet, Dr. Pepper. Oh, I can taste all 23 flavors. There were many more Spanish explorers in the first half of the 16th century, including one Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who wandered through the American Southwest looking for gold, which I mention entirely because I think that guy's last name means cowhead. Of course, none of these people found any gold, but they did make later European colonization easier by bringing over the microbes that wiped out most native populations. So the Spanish wanted to colonize Florida to set up military bases to thwart the pirates who preyed on silver-laden Spanish galleons coming out of Mexico. But Spanish missionaries also came over hoping to convert local native populations. This, of course, worked out magnificently. Just kidding, it went terribly, and many of the missions were destroyed by an uprising of Gual Indians in 1597, and I will remind you, mispronouncing things is my thing. In general, colonizing Florida sucked because it was hot and mosquito-y. Spain was much more successful at colonizing the American Southwest. In 1610, Spain established its first permanent settlement in the Southwest at Santa Fe, New Mexico, and you couldn't really say that it flourished since Santa Fe's population never got much above 3,000, but it had a great small-town feel. And New Mexico is really important because it's the site of the first large-scale uprising by Native Americans against Europeans. I mean, the native people, who the Spanish called pueblos, had seen their fortunes decline significantly since the arrival of Europeans. How much decline? Well, between 1600 and 1680, their population went from about 60,000 to about 17,000. Also, the Franciscan friars who came to convert the indigenous people became increasingly militant about stamping out all native religion. The Spanish Inquisition just wasn't very keen on the kind of cultural blending that made early conversion efforts successful. So while the Spanish saw all the pueblos as one people, they also knew there were tribal differences that made it difficult for the Indians to unite and rise up against the Spanish. But nothing unites like a common enemy, and in 1680, a religious leader named Pope organized an uprising to drive the Spaniards out. Pope organized about 2,000 warriors who killed 400 Spanish colonists and forced the rest to leave Santa Fe. So the Spanish colony in New Mexico was effectively destroyed. The pueblos tore down all the Christian churches and replaced them with kivas, their places of worship. But like most awesome uprisings, it didn't last. But after the revolt, the Spanish were much more tolerant of indigenous religion, and they also abandoned the forced labor practice called encomienda. Oh, it's time for the new Crash Course feature, the mystery document? How mysterious.
47 more mystery documents.
The rules here are simple. I read and attempt to identify the mystery document. If I am right, I do not get shocked by this shock pen, and if I am wrong, I do. Okay, what do we have here? The Indians were totally deprived of their freedom and were put in the harshest, fiercest, most horrible servitude and captivity, which no one who has not seen it can understand. Even beasts enjoy more freedom when they are allowed to graze in the fields, but our Spaniards gave no such opportunity to Indians and truly considered them perpetual slaves. I sometimes came upon dead bodies on my way, and upon others who were grasping and moaning in their death agony, repeating, "Hungry, hungry." And this was the freedom, the good treatment, and the Christianity the Indians received. Well, that's nice. Okay, so the mystery document is always a primary source, and since the writer refers to our Spaniards, I'm gonna guess that he or she, probably he, is European, and a Spaniard sympathetic to the Indians, which narrows the list of suspects considerably. So it probably wasn't De Sepulveda, for instance, who argued that the Indians might not even be human. Okay, Stan, I'm actually pretty confident here. I believe it is from a short account of the destruction of the Indies by Bartolome de las Casas. God! Dang it! Oh, Stan just told me I have the author right, but the book wrong. It's a history of the Indies. Oh, I hate shocks, both literal and metaphorical. So we focused a lot on the brutality of the Spanish toward the Indians, but at least one Spaniard, de las Casas, recognized that his countrymen were terrible. This realization is a good thing, obviously, but it leads us to one of the big problems when it comes to studying this time and place. The Black Legend is the tale that the Spanish unleashed unspeakable cruelty on the Indians. Now that tale is true, but that idea was used by later settlers, especially the English, to justify their own settlements. Like, part of the reason they needed to expand their empire was to save the Indians from the awful Spanish, but were the English so much better? Yeah, probably not. As we mentioned at the beginning of today's episode, American Indians didn't have writing, so we don't have records of their perspective. Now, some Europeans, like de las Casas, were critical of the Spaniards, but most considered the Indians heathens and implied, or even outright said, that they deserved whatever horrible things befell them. So at the beginning of our series, I want to point out something that we need to remember throughout. One of the great things about American history is that we have a lot of written sources. This is the advantage of the U.S. coming onto the scene so late in the game, historically speaking. But every story we hear comes from a certain point of view, and we always need to remember who is speaking, why they are speaking, and especially which voices go unheard and why. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Miller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my... If you ever buy anything from Apple, you should use Wikibuy. It's a browser extension that automatically compares Amazon's price. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to tell the story of how a group of plucky English people struck a blow for religious freedom and founded the greatest, freest, and fattest nation the world has ever seen. These Brits entered a barren land containing no people and quickly invented the automobile, baseball, and Star Trek, and we all lived happily ever after. Mr. Green, if it's really that simple, I am so getting an A in this class. Oh, me from the past. You're just a delight.
I'm gonna hit this song right here. Did I already say that? I don't know.
So most Americans grow up hearing that the United States was founded by pasty English people who came here to escape religious persecution. And that's true of the small proportion of people who settled in the Massachusetts Bay and created what we now know as New England. But these Pilgrims and Puritans, there's a difference, weren't the first people or even the first Europeans to come to the only part of the globe we didn't paint over. In fact, they weren't even the first English people. The first English people came to Virginia. Off topic, but how weird is it that the first permanent English colony in the Americas was named not for Queen Elizabeth's epicness, but for her supposed chastity? Right, anyway, those first English settlers weren't looking for religious freedom, they wanted to get rich. So the first successful English colony in America was founded at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. I say successful because there were two previous attempts to colonize the region. They were both epic failures, the more famous of which was the colony at Roanoke Island, set up by Sir Walter Raleigh, which is famous because all the colonists disappeared, leaving only the word Croatan carved into a tree. Jamestown was a project of the Virginia Company, which existed to make money for its investors, something it never did. The hope was that they would find gold in the Chesapeake region like the Spanish had in South America, so there were a disproportionate number of goldsmiths and jewelers there to fancy up that gold, which of course did not exist. Anyway, it turns out that jewelers dislike farming, so much so that Captain John Smith, who soon took over control of the island, once said that they would rather starve than farm. So in the first year, half of the colonists died. 400 replacements came, but by 1610, after a gruesome winter called the Starving Time, the number of colonists had dwindled to 65. And eventually word got out that the New World's one-year survival rate was like 20%, and it became harder to find new colonists. But in 1618, the Virginia Company hit upon a recruiting strategy called the headright system, which offered 50 acres of land for each person that a settler paid to bring over. And this enabled the creation of a number of large estates, which were mostly worked on and populated by indentured servants. Indentured servants weren't quite slaves, but they were kind of temporary slaves, like they could be bought and sold, and they had to do what their masters commanded. But after 7 to 10 years of that, if they weren't dead, they were paid their freedom dues, which they hoped would allow them to buy farms of their own. Sometimes that worked out, but often either the money wasn't enough to buy a farm, or else they were too dead to collect it. Even more ominously, in 1619, just 12 years after the founding of Jamestown, the first shipment of African slaves arrived in Virginia. So the colony probably would have continued to struggle along if they hadn't found something that people really loved: tobacco. Tobacco had been grown in Mexico since at least 1000 BCE, but the Europeans had never seen it, and it proved to be kind of a thank you for the smallpox, here's some lung cancer gift from the natives. Interestingly, King James hated smoking. He called it a custom loathsome to the eye and hateful to the nose, but he loved him some tax revenue, and nothing sells like drugs. By 1624, Virginia was producing more than 200,000 pounds of tobacco per year. By the 1680s, more than 30 million pounds per year. Tobacco was so profitable that colonists created huge plantations with very little in the way of towns or infrastructure to hold the social order together, a strategy that always works out brilliantly. The industry also structured Virginian society. First off, most of the people who came in the 17th century, 3/4 of them, were servants. So Virginia became a microcosm of England, a small class of wealthy landowners sitting atop a mass of servants. That sounds kind of dirty, but it was mostly just sad. The society was also overwhelmingly male, because male servants were more useful in the tobacco fields. They were the greatest proportion of immigrants. In fact, they outnumbered women 5 to 1. The women who did come over were mostly indentured servants, and if they were to marry, which they often did because they were in great demand, they had to wait until their term of service was up. This meant delayed marriage, which meant fewer children, which further reduced the number of females. Life was pretty tough for these women. But on the upside, Virginia was kind of a swamp of pestilence, so their husbands often died. And that created a small class of widows or even unmarried women who, because of their special status, could make contracts and own property, so that was good, sort of. Okay, a quick word about Maryland. Maryland was the second Chesapeake colony, founded in 1632, and by now there was no messing around with joint stock companies. Maryland was a proprietorship, a massive land grant to a single individual named Cecilius Calvert. Calvert wanted to turn Maryland into like a medieval feudal kingdom to benefit himself and his family, and he was no fan of the representational institutions that were developing in Virginia. Also, Calvert was Catholic, and Catholics were welcome in Maryland, which wasn't always the case elsewhere. Speaking of which, let's talk about Massachusetts. So Jamestown might have been the first English colony, but Massachusetts Bay is probably better known. This is largely because the colonists who came there were so recognizable for their beliefs, and also for their hats. That's right, I'm talking about the Pilgrims and the Puritans. And no, I will not be talking about Thanksgiving. Is a lie. I can't help myself, but only to clear up the difference between Pilgrims and Puritans, and also to talk about Squanto. God, I love me some Squanto. Let's go to the thought bubble. Most of the English men and women who settled in New England were uber Protestant Puritans who believed the Protestant Church of England was still too Catholic-y with its kneeling and incense and extravagantly hatted archbishops. The particular Puritans, who by the way did not call themselves that, other people did, who settled in New England were called Congregationalists because they thought congregations should determine leadership and worship structures, not bishops. The Pilgrims were even more extreme. They wanted to separate more or less completely from the Church of England. So first they fled to the Netherlands, but the Dutch were apparently too corrupt for them, so they rounded up investors and financed a new colony in 1620. They were supposed to land in Virginia, but in what perhaps should have been taken as an omen, they were blown wildly off course and ended up in what's now Massachusetts, founding a colony called Plymouth. While still on board their ship, the Mayflower, 41 of the 150 or so colonists wrote and signed an agreement called the Mayflower Compact, in which they all bound themselves to follow, quote, just and equal laws that their chosen representatives would write up. Since this was the first written framework for government in the U.S., it's kind of a big deal. But anyway, the Pilgrims had the excellent fortune of landing in Massachusetts with 6 weeks before winter, and they had the good sense not to bring carrying very much food with them or any farm animals. Half of them died before winter was out. The only reason they didn't all die was that local Indians, led by Squanto, gave them food and saved them. A year later, grateful that they had survived mainly due to the help of an alliance with the local chief Massasoit, and because the Indians had taught them how to plant corn and where to catch fish, the Pilgrims held a big feast, the first Thanksgiving. Thanks, Thought Bubble. And by the way, that feast was on the fourth Thursday in November, not mid-October, as is celebrated in some of these green areas we call not America. Anyway, Squanto was a pretty amazing character, and not only because he helped save the Pilgrims. He found that almost all of his tribe, the Patuxet, had been wiped out by disease, and eventually settled with the Pilgrims on the site of his former village, and then died of disease, because it is always ruining everything. So the Pilgrims struggled on until 1691, when their colony was subsumed by the larger and much more successful Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was chartered in 1629 by London merchants who, like the founders of the Virginia Company, hoped to make money. But unlike Virginia, the board of directors relocated from England to America, which meant that in Massachusetts they had a greater degree of autonomy and self-government than they did in Virginia. Social unity was also much more important in Massachusetts than it was in Virginia. The Puritans' religious mission meant that the common good was, at least at first, put above the needs or the rights of the individual. Those different ideas in the North and South about the role of government would continue until now. Oh god, it's time for the mystery document? The rules are simple. I read the mystery document, which I have not seen before. If I get it right, then I do not get shocked with this shock pen. If I get it wrong, I do. All right. We must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities? I don't know. For the supply of others' necessities, we must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. Alright, first thing I noticed, the author of this document is a terrible speller, or possibly wrote this before English was standardized. Also, pretty religious individual. And the community in question seems to embrace something near socialism, of bridging the superfluous for others' necessities. Also, it says that the community should be like a city upon a hill, like a model for everybody. And because of that metaphor, I know exactly where it comes from, the sermon, A Model of Christian Charity by John Winthrop. Yes! Yes! No punishment! This is one of the most important sermons in American history. It shows us just how religious the Puritans were, but it also shows us that their religious mission wasn't really one of individualism, but of collective effort. In other words, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one. But this city on a hill metaphor is the basis for one kind of American exceptionalism, the idea that we are so special and so godly that we will be a model to other nations. At least as long, according to Winthrop, as we act together. Lest you think Winthrop's words were forgotten, they did become the centerpiece of Ronald Reagan's 1989 farewell address. Okay, so New England towns were governed democratically, but that doesn't mean that the Puritans were big on equality or that everybody was able to participate in government, because no. The only people who could vote or hold office were church members, and to be a full church member, you had to be a, quote, visible saint. So really, power stayed in the hands of the church elite. The same went for equality. While it was better than in the Chesapeake colonies or England, as equality went, pretty unequal. As John Winthrop declared, some must be rich and some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection. Or as historian Eric Foner put it, inequality was considered an expression of God's will, and while some liberties applied to all inhabitants, there were separate lists of rights for freemen, women, children, and servants. There was also slavery in Massachusetts. The first slaves were recorded in the colony in 1640. However, Puritans really did foster equality in one sense. They wanted everyone to be able to read the Bible. In fact, parents could be punished by the town councils for not properly instructing their children and making them literate. But when Roger Williams called for citizens to be able to practice any religion they chose, he was banished from the colony. So was Anne Hutchinson, who argued that church membership should be based on inner grace and not on outward manifestations like church attendance. Williams went on to found Rhode Island, so that worked out fine for him. But Hutchinson, who was doubly threatening to Massachusetts because she was a woman preaching unorthodox ideas, was too radical and was further banished to Westchester, New York, where she and her family were killed by Indians. Finally, someone who doesn't die of disease or starvation. So Americans like to think of their country as being founded by pioneers of religious freedom who were seeking liberty from the oppressive English. But we've already seen that's only partly true. For one thing, Puritan ideas of equality and representation weren't particularly equitable or representational. In truth, America was also founded by indigenous people and by Spanish settlers, and the earliest English colonies weren't about religion, they were about money. We'll see this tension between American mythology and American history again next week, and also every week. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Miller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written...
Good to see you. Yeah, hey, what's with the polka dots?
Another ad.
What do you mean? Polka dots are out. It's polka square.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about one of the worst relationships in American history. No, thought bubble, not my college girlfriend and me. Mr. Green, your relationship with your high school girlfriend? Oh, me from the past. You and I both know that I didn't have a high school girlfriend. No, I'm talking about the relationship between Native Americans and English settlers. So as you'll no doubt remember from last week, the first English settlers came to the Chesapeake area, now Virginia, in 1607. The land the English found was, of course, already inhabited by Indian tribes unified under the leadership of Chief Wahunsonica, and I will remind you that mispronouncing things is my thing. The English called this chief Powhatan, because, of course, mispronouncing things was also their thing. Powhatan was actually his title and the name of his tribe, but to say that the English lacked cultural sensitivity would be an understatement. So Powhatan didn't get to be the leader of over 30 tribes by being a dummy, and he quickly realized that 1, the English were pretty clueless when it came to not dying of starvation, and 2, they were useful, because they had guns. So he decided to help them, and the English were indeed grateful. In fact, colony leader John Smith went so far as to order the colonists to stop stealing food from the Indians. Oh, in the book business, this is known as foreshadowing. So as previously noted, relationships, whether between individuals or collectives, tend to go well when they are mutually beneficial. And for a while, both the English and the Indians were better off for these interactions. I mean,
Hopefully this makes it run
post-smallpox. The Virginia Company existed to make money, and since the Chesapeake lacked gold or silver, making money required trade. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. We tend to think of trade between Europeans and natives as being a one-way exchange, like savvy, exploitative Europeans tricking primitive, pure indigenous people into unfair deals, but that isn't quite accurate. Both sides traded goods that they had in surplus for those they did not. The English were happy to give up iron utensils, tools, guns, woven cloth, in exchange for furs and, especially in the early days, food, which the Indians could easily part with because they had plenty. Soon, though, there were problems. In order to keep up trade relations, Indian men devoted more time to hunting and less to agriculture, which upset traditional gender balance in their society, and European ideas about land use started to overcome traditional Indian ways of life, and that led to conflict. The English liked to fence in some of their land, which kept the Indians off it, and also the English let their pigs and cattle roam freely, and the animals would eat natives' crops. And as Europeans' appetite for furs grew, Indian tribes began to fight with each other over access to the best hunting grounds, leading to intertribal warfare, which suddenly included guns. But this was still a relatively calm time. Yes, at one point John Smith was captured by the Indians and had to be saved by Powhatan's daughter Pocahontas, but this was probably all a ritual planned by Powhatan to demonstrate his dominance over the English. Pocahontas never married John Smith, by the way, but she was kidnapped by the English and held for ransom in 1613, and she did eventually marry another Englishman, John Rolfe. She converted to Christianity and went to England, where she became a sensation and died of disease. Stupid disease, always deciding the course of human history. Anyway, despite not marrying Pocahontas, John Smith is still important to this story because when he left Virginia for England after being injured in a gunpowder explosion, things between the Native Americans and the English immediately began to deteriorate. How? Well, the English went back to stealing Indians' crops and also began stealing their lives via massacres. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Man, you guys sure know how to end on a downer, although to be fair, there are not a lot of uppers in this story. So after a period of peace following Pocahontas' marriage to John Rolfe in 1614, dramatized here, things finally came to a head in 1622 when Chief Opechancanough led a rebellion against the English. It had become abundantly clear that more and more English were going to show up, and they weren't just there to trade, they wanted to take Indian land. But the English struck back, as empires will, and the uprising of 1622 ultimately failed. And after another failed uprising in 1644, the 2,000 remaining Native Americans were forced to sign a treaty that consigned them to reservations in the West, well, the west of Virginia at least. But the 1622 uprising was the final nail in the coffin of the Virginia Company, which was a failure in every way. It never turned a profit, and despite sponsoring 6,000 colonists, by 1644, when Virginia became a royal colony, only 1,200 of those people were still alive, proving once again that governments are better at governing than corporations. Up in New England, you'll recall that the Pilgrims probably wouldn't have survived their first winter without help from the Native Americans, which of course led to the first Thanksgiving and then centuries of mutually beneficial trade and generosity. Just kidding. While some of the Puritans who settled in New England, notably Roger Williams, tried to treat the Indians fairly, in general it was very similar to what we saw in the Chesapeake. Settlers thought Native Americans could be replaced because they weren't properly using the land. Now, John Winthrop, who you'll remember from last week, at least realized that it was better to buy land from Indians than just take it. But Puritan land purchases usually came with strings attached, the main string being that the Native Americans had to submit to English authority. Now, the Puritans had a rather conflicted view of the Indians. On the one hand, they saw natives as heathens in need of salvation, as evidenced by the Massachusetts seal, which features an Indian saying, "Come over and help us." On the other hand, they recognized that the Native American way of life, with its relative abundance and equality, especially when it came to women, might be tempting to some people who might want to go native. This was such a concern that in 1642, the Massachusetts General Court prescribed a sentence of 3 years hard labor for anyone who left the colony and went to live with the indigenous people. There was even anti-India propaganda in the form of books, captivity narratives, in which Europeans recounted their desire to return to Christian society after living with the Indians, were quite popular, even though some, like the famous Sovereignty and Goodness of God by Mary Rowlandson, did admit that the Indians often treated their European captives quite well. New England's native population lacked an overarching leader like Powhatan, but by 1637, the inevitable conflict between the English and the Indians did happen. It was called the Pequot War. After some Pequots killed an English fur trader, soldiers from Massachusetts, the newly formed colony of Connecticut, and some Narragansett Indians, who saw an opportunity to gain an upper hand over the Pequots, attacked a Pequot village at Mystic, burning it and massacring over 500 people. The war continued for a few months after this, but to call it a war is in a way to give it too much credit. The Indians were overmatched from the beginning, and by the end, almost all of them had been massacred or sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The war opened up the Connecticut River to further settlement. It also showed that Native Americans were going to have a tough time resisting because they were outnumbered and they had inferior weapons. But the brutality of the massacre in Mystic shocked even some Puritans, like William Bradford, who wrote, "It was a fearful sight to see them frying in the fire." But despite the odds, New England natives continued to resist the English. In 1675, Native Americans launched their biggest attack on New England colonists in what would come to be known as King Philip's War. It was led by a Wampanoag chief named Metacom, which is why it is also sometimes called Metacom's War. The English called Metacom King Philip due to their fantastic cultural sensitivity. The conflict was marked by brutality on both sides, and it nearly ended English settlements in the Northeast. The fighting itself lasted 2 years. Indians attacked half of the 90 towns the English had founded, and 12 of those towns were destroyed. About 1,000 of the 52,000 Europeans and 3,000 of the 20,000 Indians involved died in the war. As I mentioned before, the war was particularly brutal. The Battle of the Great Swamp was really just a massacre of Indians by the English, and when King Philip was finally killed, ending the war, his decapitated head was placed on a stake in the Plymouth Town Square, where it remained for decades. And on the other side, well, to quote Nathaniel Saltonstall, who lived through the war, the heathen rarely gave quarter to those that they take, but if they were women, they first forced them to satisfy their filthy lusts and then murdered them. Saltonstall went on to describe a particularly brutal way that natives would kill colonists' cows, by cutting their bellies and letting them go several days, trailing their guts after them. That indigenous people would reserve such brutality for livestock says something really important about this war. The Indians correctly saw European colonization as a threat to their way of life, and that included the animals who trampled Indians' land and whose grazing patterns required the English to take more and more territory. Some of the stories told about Native American brutality also suggest the symbolic nature of this war, like one English colonist was disemboweled and had a Bible stuck in his body cavity. Supposedly, the natives who buried him explained, "You English, since you came into this country, have grown exceedingly above the ground. Let us see how well you grow when planted into the ground."
Hello,
but it wasn't
everybody.
just the Indians who
This is
felt their
awesome.
way of life being
Thank you,
threatened.
Mr.
It's
Terry.
time for this week's mystery document. The rules here are simple. I read the mystery document, I try to guess its author. If I'm right, I don't get shocked with the shock pen. If I'm wrong, I do. The righteous God hath heightened our calamity and given commission to the barbarous heathen to rise up against us and to become a smart rod and a severe scourge to us in burning and depopulating several hopeful plantations, murdering many of our people of all sorts, and seeming as it were to cast us off. Hereby speaking aloud to us to search and try out our ways and turn again unto the Lord our God, from whom we have departed with a great backsliding. Okay, I don't know this one, so I'm going to have to piece it together. We have a plural narrator. That's important. Seemingly monotheistic. Feels like the heathens, in this context likely the Native Americans, have been sent as a scourge, or scourge, as it is apparently properly pronounced. What? I'm from Alabama. I don't know how to say a ton of words. I mean, I just recently learned that you don't check your Yahoo mail, you check your Yahoo mail. And Yahoo's over already. Right, so plural narrator, scourge, great backsliding. Stan, you're gonna get to shock me this time. Who is it? The laws of war passed by the General Court of Massachusetts in 1675? Are you kidding? From now on, the mystery document must always be written by a single human person. I hate this. I hate this so much. It's worse now, because I've had it before, so now it's gonna... This shows us the way the Puritans understand the world, but it also shows us that within 50 years of its founding, Puritans already felt the mission of their colony to be a great Christian community was already kind of a failure. If they'd been as righteous as they were supposed to be, God wouldn't have sent the Indians to burn their homes and kill them. So it's important to understand that this was a war to preserve a way of life for both the Indians and the Indians. And that brings us to another question. What's the point of even telling these bloody stories about massacres and atrocities? One point is to remind ourselves that much of what we learn about American history, like all history, has been cleaned up to conform to our mythological view of ourselves. Native Americans have been so successfully marginalized, both geographically and metaphorically, that it's easy to either forget about them or else to view them merely as people to be pitied or reviled. But it's important to know the ways that they resisted colonization, because it reminds us that Native Americans were people who acted in history, not just people who were acted upon by it. And it also reminds us that the history of indigenous people on this landmass isn't separate from American history. It's an essential part of it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. And the show is written by my high school history teacher, Raul Meyer, and myself. Our graphics team is Thought Bubble. If you have questions about today's video,
so I just ordered these 4 pizzas here, and it was supposed to cost me over $100, but it ended up costing me only $65. Okay, so first, Domino's. .com. Choose your favorite pizza.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to cram 150 years of American history into one video. Why? Well, many American history classes don't cover the colonial period at all, because most major American history tests have like one question about it. Mr. Green, so this isn't going to be on the test? That's awesome, because I have some flirtatious notes to exchange with Jessica Alvarez. Yeah, me from the past. So listen, would you rather do well on one test or lead a richer, more productive life as a result of having a better understanding of the complicated factors that led to the creation of the greatest nation in history? Stan, can I get a liberty?
Instagram or something? Please let me know in the comments.
So listen up, me from the past. It's time to bask in our own greatness. And by greatness, I mean morally dubious dominance over people who would have been just fine without us. So contrary to popular mythology, colonial America was more than just Jamestown and Massachusetts. There was, for instance, New Amsterdam. The tale goes that Dutch traders bought the island of Manhattan from Lenape Indians for $24 in 1624. That isn't quite true, but it contains a truth. The Dutch traders who founded their colony were businessmen, and New Amsterdam was above everything else a commercial venture. This is still true in New York, actually. I mean, Manhattan is all about Wall Street. In fact, Crash Course writer and history teacher Raul Meyer is believed to be the last person living on the island of Manhattan who does not work for an investment bank. So the Dutch let anyone into New Amsterdam who could help them turn a profit, including Jews and even Quakers, but they didn't like Indians very much. In fact, they drove them out of the colony. But anyway, the $24 the Lenape supposedly got for New England was $24 more than the Dutch got when the English took over the colony in 1664 by sailing 4 frigates into the harbor and asking for the colony in a threatening voice. So New Amsterdam became New York, which was a mixed blessing. The population doubled in the decade after the English takeover, but English rule meant less economic freedom for women who, under the Dutch, were able to inherit property and conduct business for themselves, and under the English, free black people lost a lot of the jobs they'd been able to hold under the Dutch. Things were better in Pennsylvania, so much so that it was known as the best poor man's country, which admittedly in the 17th century was a low bar to jump over. Given by Charles II to this guy, William Penn, in 1681, Pennsylvania was a huge tract of land round about here. The land included contemporary Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey, but we've made an editorial decision not to talk about New Jersey here on Crash Course due to my long-standing anti-New Jersey bias. So Penn wanted his colony to be a haven for Quakers because he was a Quaker, as you know if you've ever seen a container of Quaker oats. Quakers were a pretty tolerant bunch, except when it came to slavery, which they opposed vehemently. And under Penn's leadership, the colony showed remarkable religious toleration and also an amazing respect for Indian communities, but then, after Penn was gone, yeah, the usual. In 1737, Pennsylvania colonists perpetrated one of the most famous frauds of colonial America, the walking purchase. Indians agreed to cede a tract of land bounded by the distance a man could walk in 36 hours, but the clever Governor James Logan hired a bunch of fast runners who marked out territory much larger than the Indians anticipated. Quakers had to resort to such tricks because they were pacifists. I should also mention that they weren't particularly fond of loose living. The government prevented swearing and drunkenness, for instance, but, you know, it was still pretty great compared to the other colonies. More than half of the male population was eligible to vote, and Pennsylvania's dual promise of religious freedom and cheap land attracted a lot of German immigrants. Well, I should say German-speaking immigrants. There was, of course, not a Germany at the time, as many viewers of Crash Course World History have pointed out to me. And now let us venture south, where we will find many mosquito-borne illnesses and somewhat less abolitionist sentiment. In 1663, English King Charles II gave 8 proprietors the right to set up a colony just north of the Spanish-controlled Florida to serve as a buffer. This became South Carolina, and its original settlers came from the sugar colony of Barbados, which helps to explain why they were so awesome at slavery. They tried to enslave the Indians and ship them to the Caribbean, but when that didn't work out, they began to import African slaves. We're going to talk a lot more about slavery in future episodes, but for now, just bear in mind it sucked. Okay, so in the last quarter of the 17th century, the British colonies in the Americas experienced a series of crises. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the document, I get it right, no shock, I get it wrong, shock. Okay, we accuse Sir William Berkeley as guilty of each and every one of the same, and as one who has traitorously attempted, violated, and injured His Majesty's interests here by a loss of a great part of his colony and many of his faithful, loyal subjects, by him betrayed and in a barbarous and shameful manner exposed to the incursions and murder of the heathen. And we do further declare these ensuing persons in this list to have been his wicked and pernicious counselors. Both wicked and pernicious, those are some terrible counselors. Okay, so this guy clearly hated William Berkeley, who I happen to know was governor of Virginia. Particularly upset about the colonists being incurred upon and murdered by the heathen, that is, the Native Americans. I mean, I have a guess, but I'm not brimming with confidence. The one person I know who hated William Berkeley was Nathaniel Bacon. Yes! 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 No shock for me and no pleasure for you, you schadenfreude Crash Course viewers. So Nathaniel Bacon arrived in Virginia in 1673 and led an armed uprising against Governor Berkeley just 3 years later. And just to be clear, he was mad not because Berkeley did a poor job protecting colonists from Indians, but because Berkeley wouldn't allow them to kill more Indians and take more land. Berkeley had already given all the really good land to his cronies, those aforementioned wicked and pernicious counselors, leaving men like Bacon with serious beef. I hate myself. Before the rebellion was quelled by the arrival of English warships, Bacon burned Jamestown and made himself ruler of Virginia and looted Berkeley's supporters' land. 23 of the rebels were hanged, but not Bacon, who died shortly after taking control from, you guessed it, dysentery. Dang it, dysentery! It's called history, not dysentery-story. Bacon's rebellion is sometimes portrayed as an early example of lower-class artisans and would-be farmers rising up against the corrupt British elite, which I guess kind of. But the biggest effects of the rebellion were 1, a shift away from indentured servants to slaves, and 2, a general desire by the English crown to control the colonies more. Okay, so in 1686, King James II really tried to put the hammer down by consolidating Connecticut, Plymouth, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New York, and East and West Jersey into one big mega-colony called the Dominion of New England. Its near-dictatorial ruler was former New York Governor EDMUND, who proceeded to appoint his own officials and lay his own taxes without even consulting any of the elected assemblies. Luckily, or unluckily, depending on your perspective, a major event in British history reversed this policy, the Glorious Revolution. Now, thankfully, this isn't Crash Course British history, or it would quickly turn into Crash Course John is Bored history. But the upshot is that Britain got a fancy new royal family from Holland, which sparked uprisings in the colonies, and Andros was thrown into a Boston jail as the colonies reasserted their independence. And these new guys imposed the English Toleration Act of 1690, which decreed that all Protestants could worship freely. As Toleration Acts go, this one wasn't that tolerant. I mean, it still discriminated against Jews, but it did mark the end of the Puritan experiment. No longer would membership in a Congregationalist church be a requirement for voting in general court elections. Property ownership would now be the determining factor. And Massachusetts would now have a governor from England, not from a company board residing inside the colony itself. This was the context for one of the most talked about events in colonial history, the Salem witch trials. A lot of ink has been expended on this incident, and the interpretations of it are numerous and controversial, so I'm just going to point out that when the witch trials, which claimed the lives of 14 of the nearly 150 women and men accused of witchcraft, happened in 1691, New England as a colony had basically just failed in its religious mission. The Tolerance Act meant that people in Massachusetts would have to accept even Quakers as virtual equals. Quakers! So it's not surprising that colonists would look for scapegoats or that their male leaders would seek to reassert their gender dominance. Okay, to talk about colonial American economics, let's go to the thought bubble. Most colonists were farmers or worked on farms, and they were mostly small, unlike the giant plantations that predominated in the Caribbean. Since New England contains relatively little in the way of tropical diseases and was increasingly free of Native Americans, the colonial population there skyrocketed, so fast that families began to run out of land, so second and third sons increasingly had to go make their way in growing coastal cities. We'll talk about this more in future episodes, but for now let's just note the idea of a person owning a small farm and the idea of freedom are pretty closely intertwined in the early part of American history. It's more of an amber waves of grain place than a behold this metropolis place. In fact, they were richer than any other colonial elites. Were they rich enough to dominate the Constitutional Convention? Time will tell. Now, not everyone was a farmer or a slave. There were growing numbers of artisans in the colonies. Although British colonial policy discouraged local manufacturing, the growing population in America meant that there was certain to be a market for locally produced goods, especially clothing and metalwork. Remember, one of the heroes of the American Revolution, Paul Revere, was a silversmith. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So that variety of jobs leads us nicely to our last topic today, colonial society. Although Americans like to think of themselves as classless, pun intended, that's not really the case. I mean, the colonies definitely had an elite ruling class, especially in the South, that did what it could to perpetuate itself. George Washington's father and grandfather were both justices of the peace, an important role in colonial times, meaning that George Washington had deeply elite roots. So that was the top of colonial society, and at the bottom was a growing number of poor people. While it's never good to be poor, it was much better to be poor in the colonies than it was in England or much of the rest of Europe, which is why people kept indenturing themselves to get here. America had lots of food, and there was the possibility of maybe someday getting some land, provided you didn't die of dysentery. Oh, and also provided you weren't a woman. Married women in 18th century colonial America generally couldn't own property, and husbands usually willed their land to their sons and their personal items to their daughters, meaning that almost all landowners were male. In the earliest days of colonization, when everyone was needed to ensure the survival of the colonies, women had a greater role in the economy, although they were still expected to be wives and mothers above all else. Male dominance was written into law and solidified in practice. Women's work was mostly confined to the home, and especially for lower-class women, it involved a lot of drudgery. As one woman, Mary Cooper, wrote in her diary in 1769, "I am dirty and distressed, almost wearied to death. This day is 40 years since I left my father's house and come here, and here have I seen little else but hard labor and sorrow." And that's actually a good place to end, because it reminds us that history is about much more than the lives of kings like James II and rebels like Nathaniel Bacon. And while history classes and exams tend to focus on those kinds of men, and they were mostly men, the real story of history is about regular people trying to take care of their families and not die. The colonial era often gets skipped for its lack of large-scale drama, but those small-scale dramas can be found in abundance. Next week we'll go back to all that great men and dramatic events crap when we start talking about the American Revolution. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to discuss the events that led to the American Revolution. So we'll begin with the 7 Years' War, which as Crash Course World History fans will remember Winston Churchill referred to as the First World War. The Americans called it the French and Indian War, the Prussians called it the Third Silesian War, Swedes called it the Pomeranian War. For today, we're just going to call it the 7 Years' War on account of how it lasted for 9 years. So here at Crash Course, we take a broad view of history, and rather than talking about the minute details of wars, we try to focus on the important stuff. Causes, effects, anytime Vladimir Putin might show up, and teacup kittens. And as far as causes go, the 7 Years' War was really, like most wars, about economics. Mr. Green, is this economics class? Because I don't remember signing up for it. Yeah, this is economics class to me from the past. It's economics and religion and psychology and anthropology and astronomy and physics and ecology and literature. That's the great thing about history. You can't put the past into little boxes that you study for 50 minutes a day until the bell rings. You can't separate what happened from what people wanted and believed and valued. Right, so mercantilism was the key economic theory of the British Empire in the 18th century. Because while Adam Smith and David Ricardo were talking up free trade and economic liberalism by 1750, no one was really listening. Mercantilism was basically the idea that the government should regulate the economy in order to increase national power. This meant encouraging local production through tariffs and monopolies, and also trying to ensure a favorable balance of trade. And colonies were an awesome way to create this favorable trade balance because they both produced raw materials and bought back finished goods made from those raw materials. But for it to work, you always need more and more land, so you can have more raw materials and more colonists to buy finished goods. By the way, it's important to understand the centrality of slavery in this colonial economy. I mean, the most important colonial trade goods were tobacco and sugar, and both of those crops relied heavily on slave labor. And slaves themselves were a key trade good in the so-called triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the colonies. As one historian put it, the growth and prosperity of the emerging society of free colonial British America were achieved as a result of slave labor. So Britain's greatest rival in the 18th century was France. Like, on paper, the Spanish had a more significant empire in North America, and they'd certainly been there longer, but their empire was really sparsely populated. In fact, by 1800, Los Angeles, the most populous town in Spanish California, had a population of 300 and only 17 freeways. The French colonies were considerably more populous, but even so, by 1750, there were only about 65,000 French colonists, most of them in the St. Lawrence River Valley, thereabouts. I don't know, maybe it was somewhere over here. This isn't a terribly detailed map, and also I'm not looking at it. But the French were moving into the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys and forming alliances with American Indians there to try to dominate the fur and deerskin trades, and that proved problematic. So wars usually have really complicated causes, and it's very rare that we can refer to one thing as making them inevitable. Fortunately, the 7 Years' War is the exception to that rule. Dan, I think I just used the word exception, which means it's time for a montage. I guess they heard there was an exception in town. So in 1749, the governor of Virginia awarded a huge land grant to something called the Ohio Company, which was basically a real estate development firm designed to benefit the governor of Virginia's friends. The Native Americans and their French supporters thought this was bad form because they thought they had rights to the land. So the Ohio Company asked the French to recognize their land claims, and the French were like, no! Let's go to the thought bubble. The actual fighting began when the British, or more precisely British colonists, led by a 21-year-old militia colonel named George Washington, yes, that George Washington, tried to eject the French from the forts they were constructing in western Pennsylvania. The first attempt in 1754 was a disaster. Washington built and then abandoned the ironically named Fort Necessity, with the loss of 1/3 of his men. It was followed by the equally unsuccessful attack on Fort Duquesne, now located in downtown Pittsburgh, where the French and Indians pounded the British, killing 2/3 of General Braddock's forces and also General Braddock. Things didn't go much better for the British for the next 2 years, although they did take control of part of Nova Scotia and kick out more than 11,000 French Acadians, many of whom died in what is called the Expulsion. Some of those who didn't ended up in Louisiana and became Cajuns. But anyway, the tide began to turn for the British in 1759 when they captured French forts Duquesne, finally, Ticonderoga, and Louisburg. The biggest victory of all came in September, when the British trounced the French at the Plains of Abraham near Quebec. Montreal surrendered the next year. The rest of the battles aren't that important unless you were fighting in them, and I'm sure you can count on the French and Indian War aficionados to fill the gaps in comments, but suffice it to say that the British were victorious in North America, the Caribbean, Europe, and as far away as India. The war continued officially for 3 more years and ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So the most obvious result of the war was territorial changes, particularly in the green areas of not America. And even though Britain won the war, they arguably got the short end of the territorial stick. Under the terms of the Peace of Paris, Britain got Canada from France and Florida from Spain, in return, France got Guadeloupe and Martinique, Caribbean sugar islands that were much more valuable, at least monetarily, than Canada. Sorry, Canada, but if you want to be valuable, grow some sugar. And not sugar beets either, Canada. Real sugar. And Spain got Cuba with its awesome sugar trade, and the Philippines with its proximity to China, which were much more valuable than Florida. I mean, at the time, Florida did not even have Disney World. Instead, it had yellow fever. But the real losers of the war were not the British or the Spanish or the French, but the Native Americans. The shuffling of territories meant the French were out of the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys, and the American Indians were stuck with the British, who kind of sucked. And as the British moved west, Native Americans felt compelled to fight back. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. If I'm wrong about the author of the mystery document, I will be shocked by electricity. If I am right, I will be shocked by my knowledge of 18th century primary sources. Okay, here we go. We humbly conceive that it is contrary to the maxims of good policy and extremely dangerous to our frontiers to suffer any Indians of what tribe soever to live within the inhabited parts of this province while we are engaged in an Indian war, as experience has taught us that they are all perfidious, and their claim to freedom and independence puts it in their power to act as spies, to entertain and give intelligence to our enemies, and to furnish them with provisions and warlike stores. To this fatal intercourse between our pretended friends and open enemies, we must ascribe the greatest of the ravages and murders that have been committed in the course of this and the last Indian war. We therefore pray that this grievance be taken under consideration and remedied. Enough. Usually, you either know it or you don't. And I don't. The author is clearly not an Indian. The first person plural makes me think the author is probably not an individual, which makes it harder. Certainly we're getting a taste of the tension between colonists and Native Americans on the frontier. But who is writing about this tension, I have absolutely no idea. Stan, you get to shock me. Who is it? Are you serious? I told you it has to be an individual person! Fine.
3 for
So after the end of the Seven Years'
Yes.
War, American Indians organized an armed revolt. In 1763, Indians, particularly from the Ottawa and Delaware tribes, launched what has come to be known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Now, of course, the rebellion ultimately failed to dislodge the British, but the Native Americans did manage to besiege Detroit and kill hundreds of settlers. And that convinced the British that if they wanted to avoid future conflicts, they should slow down the colonist settlements into the territories. So the British Parliament issued the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbids settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains and reserved that territory for Indians. Now that sounds like a sensible policy until you remember that the British colonists had just finished fighting a war in order to get the right to move into that very territory. So the settlers duly ignored the Proclamation Line and got down to settling. The other big outcome of the 7 Years' War was that it set up the American Revolution. I mean, you've just seen colonists ignoring the British Parliament. We'll talk more about that next week, but around the end of the 7 Years' War, new ideas like republicanism were taking root in the colonies. Republicanism initially meant supporting a government without a king, but in the colonies it came to mean something broader. Now, they didn't believe that everyone was equal. Republicans believed that only property-owning citizens possessed virtue, which was defined in the 18th century not as being like morally good, but as a willingness to subordinate one's personal interest to the public good. This type of republicanism harkened back to a Roman ideal, only, without Caesar stabbing and togas. Stan, I wish you wouldn't. And a second type of political philosophy grew out of ideas that in the 18th century were called liberalism. For classical liberals, the main task of government was to protect citizens' natural rights, which were defined by John Locke as life, liberty, and property. For liberals like Locke, governments were the result of a social contract whereby individuals would give up some of their liberty in exchange for a government protecting their natural rights. So republicanism and liberalism were undermining traditional political authority, and so was the Great Awakening, in which Americans awakened from being very religious to being super religious. The Great Awakening took place in the early decades of the 18th century, and it was a revitalization of religious feeling, energized by revival meetings and the introduction of new denominations. In the early part of the 17th century, most of the English colonists were Anglicans, unless you count the Catholics running Maryland. But by the time of the Great Awakening, there were also Presbyterians and Baptists and Methodists, so my! Even the old-line Congregationalist churches were challenged by so-called New Light ministers who placed less of an emphasis on predestination and more on an individual's experience of salvation or being born again. So religion became much more emotional in the colonies, especially after the arrival of the Englishman George Whitefield, who went on a preaching tour from 1739 to 1741. The main thrust of his sermons was that humans need only repent to avoid the horrors of damnation and be saved. And he believed that salvation was within each individual. It's worth noting that this rise in religious fervor was not confined to America or even to Christianity. Like, for instance, Wahhabism, the Islamic reform movement that's still very closely associated with Saudi Arabia, began in the Middle East around the same time. So one of the keys in the American Revolution was a breakdown in respect for authority. And this was fueled partly by economics, partly by political philosophies that undermined faith and governance from afar, and partly by religious revivals that criticized not only church hierarchies, but also other aspects of colonial society. I mean, if people were going so far as to criticize their religious leaders and established religious norms, is it any wonder that they would criticize the acts of a parliament working an ocean away? We'll find out next week. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson, and our graphics team is Thought Bubble. If you have questions...
You get closer. That still works. Still works. Still works.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we begin discussing the American Revolution. So 2 things to keep in mind here. 1, the American Revolution and the American War for Independence are not the same thing. And 2, while I know this will upset some of you, the American Revolution was not really about taxes. Mr. Green, it was about tea, right? Also, it was not about tea. The Boston Tea Party was about taxes and our God-given right to smuggle. It's a little confusing me from the past, but that's why Crash Course is here. So as you'll recall, the 7 Years' War ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which made the colonists cranky because it limited their ability to take land from the Indians, and it also left them holding the bag for a lot of war debt. Wars, as you may have noticed, are expensive, and the British government had to borrow £150 million, and the interest payments on that money ate up half of the national budget. So in order to pay for the war, the British decided to raise taxes. And since the primary beneficiaries of the war had been the American colonists, the British government felt it was only fair if some of the burden fell to them. Now, taxes on colonial trade were nothing new. The British government had placed taxes on a bunch of items in order to reduce competition with Britain, including wool and hats and mole asses. Why did they place a tax on mole asses? It doesn't seem like that would be a huge market. Oh, molasses. But those taxes were about trying to regulate trade in a mercantilist way more than trying to pay back war debt, and also they were easy to avoid via smuggling, which we did because this is America. But mostly the colonists were angry because they didn't have any say about the new taxes that Britain was imposing. I mean, after all, by 1760, some colonies had been setting their own taxes through their own legislatures for 100 years. So the taxes themselves weren't really the problem. It was their lack of parliamentary representation. The first purportedly oppressive tax, the Sugar Act of 1764, extended the Molasses Act by changing the tax on imports from the Caribbean from 6 cents per gallon all the way up to 3 cents per gallon. So they actually cut the tax, but they decided to start enforcing it by stamping out smuggling. And to that end, the act also gave British courts the right to try colonial smugglers, taking that power away from colonial courts, which had been notoriously lenient when it came to smuggling on account of how they enjoyed smuggled rum as much as the next guy. But those initial acts weren't nearly as annoying as the Stamp Act, passed in 1765. The Stamp Act declared that all printed material had to carry a stamp. Unsurprisingly, that stamp was not free. This was purely to gain revenue for Britain, and it mostly affected people who used a lot of paper, you know, like newspaper printers and lawyers, just the kind of people you want to anger about taxes. So in October, protesters organized the Stamp Act Congress, which after a meeting decided to boycott British goods, and this was the first major coordinated action by all the colonies together, and it might be the first time that we can speak of the colonies acting in a united way, almost like, say, a government. Committees of correspondence, which had been created to encourage opposition to earlier acts, now grew to coordinate the boycott efforts, and they helped people become more aware of their liberties, and they also spurred street actions that occasionally became violent. These direct actions were organized by groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, and guess what? Coordinated action worked. The British Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but they did pass the Declaratory Act, which was all like, listen, you're not the boss of us. We can tax you. We don't want to tax you right now as it happens, but we could if we wanted to, but we won't, but we could. So the repeal of the Stamp Act was seen by many in the colonies as a huge victory, but most of the people organizing the protests were elites, you know, the kind of people who use paper. But once you start talking about the idea of representation, everybody wants in. Meanwhile, Great Britain still needed money, so Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend got Parliament to pass new taxes in 1767. The so-called Townshend Acts also created a new Board of Customs to stop smuggling, which we didn't like one bit. You don't like it when I say we? Well, tough luck. I'm an American. Bring back the Libertage, Stan!
I really like that graphic.
Many colonists again responded with a boycott, and women got in on the act this time, with the Daughters of Liberty encouraging homespun clothes to replace British ones. But not all the states were on board. Like, artisans loved the boycotts because they got more money. But merchants from cities like Philadelphia and New York weren't so happy because they made their livings by importing and selling the very goods that were now being boycotted. On occasion, protests did get out of hand, as in the Boston Massacre of March 5th, 1770, which, while it was not much of a massacre, was definitely the worst outcome of a snowball fight in American history. I mean, 5 colonists were killed, including most famously Crispus Attucks, a sailor of mixed-race ancestry. And then, of the 9 British soldiers put on trial, 7 were acquitted and 2 were convicted only of manslaughter thanks to the top-notch lawyering of one John Adams. Don't worry, though, that guy comes around in the American cause. But overall, boycotts and protests were effective, and British merchants pushed for the repeal of these acts, leaving only a tax on tea. Let's go to the thought bubble. The 1773 Tea Act offered tax exemptions and rebates for tea coming in from the British East India Company, which allowed them to dump cheap tea on the colonies, which actually lowered the price of tea. So why were the colonists so mad that on December 16, 1773, they dressed up as Indians and dumped enough tea into Boston Harbor to cause the modern equivalent of a $4 million loss? Some colonists were upset that cheap tea would cut into the profits of smugglers and established tea merchants, but most were just angry on principle. To our great national shame, tea was at the time as important a beverage in the colonies as it was to Brits living in Britain, and to allow the British to tax a near universal product set a precedent that Britain could tax whatever they wanted. But the Tea Partiers miscalculated, thinking that the British would back down in response to their protest. Instead, the British responded by passing a series of acts that colonists came to call the Intolerable Acts. The Massachusetts Government Act curtailed self-government there. The Quartering Act forced colonists to house British soldiers in their homes when ordered to. The Quebec Act extended the southern boundary of Quebec and granted religious toleration to Catholics, which was none too popular with the Great Awakening crowd having recently awoken. The colonial response to these acts is really the start of the American Revolution. First, Massachusetts passed a set of resolutions calling for colonists to 1. Disobey the Intolerable Acts, 2. Stop paying taxes, and 3. Prepare for war. And in September 1774, a group of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia, met in Philadelphia to coordinate the resistance of the Intolerable Act. This was the first Continental Congress, which in setting up the Continental Association to police the boycott and encourage domestic manufacturing was the first real colony-wide government in British America. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So this sort of phenomenon is known by historians as kind of a big deal. I mean, coordinating action to achieve some end is what governments do, so it's not an exaggeration to say that the first Continental Congress was the first government of America. You might even say that sending delegates to Philadelphia in 1774 was the first truly revolutionary act of the American Revolution, but it was not a call for independence. However, there was a changing attitude among many colonists, because rather than seeing themselves as standing up for their rights as English people, they began to make claims based on abstract ideas about freedom and natural rights. In this respect, the Continental Congress was between worlds, because it justified its actions as liberties of free and natural-born subjects within the realm of England, but it also talked about immutable laws of nature. And this idea that all humans have certain rights derived from natural law has become a pretty big deal, not just in the United States, but also in the green lands of not America. I mean, these days, human rights is a phrase that we bandy about with Putin. Do you show up every time the words human rights are mentioned to make sure that we're talking about China and not you? And this brings me back to an important point. Although we tend to equate the two, the American Revolution and the American War for Independence were not the same thing. I mean, for one thing, the fighting started 15 months before the Declaration of Independence. For another, simply declaring independence does not make you an independent nation, as I will now demonstrate. I hereby declare this studio the independent nation of John Green, Sylvania! Yeah, see, nothing happened. The war between colonists and Britain began in 1775, on April 19th to be exact, when fighting broke out between British soldiers and Massachusetts militiamen, the Minutemen, at Concord and Lexington, or Lexington and Concord, depending on whether you live in Lexington or Concord. This was the famous shot heard round the world, immortalized in Longfellow's poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. So while the colonists actually lost the famous Battle of Bunker Hill, which was technically fought on Breed's Hill, the British suffered such heavy casualties that soon thereafter they were forced to abandon Boston. But then they got some revenge by taking over New York, which they held for most of the rest of the war. But in thinking about the war, it's very important to understand that not all colonists were pro-independence. Like elites in colonies like New York and Pennsylvania were very nervous about all this revolutionary fervor that was whipping up artisans and small-time farmers to think that they deserved to have say in the political process. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? Awesome, I love getting shocked.
This is like my least favorite part.
The rules here are simple. If I guess the author of the mystery document correctly, I do not get the shock pin. If I'm wrong, I do get the shock pin. Alright, let's see what we got here. The Americans are properly Britons. They have the manners, habits, and ideas of Britons and have been accustomed to a similar form of government. But Britons could never bear the extremes, either of monarchy or republicanism. Some of their kings have aimed at despotism, but always failed. Repeated efforts have been made toward democracy, and they equally failed. If we may judge of future events by past transactions, in similar circumstances, this would most probably be the case in America, were a republican form of government adopted in our present ferment. Alright, so we've got an educated person who thinks that Americans are Britons who will inevitably want to walk a middle path between republicanism and monarchy, and therefore that the revolution is not a good idea. I know it's a colonist because of the reference to our present ferment. Alright, I am going to guess that it is Ben Franklin's son, William Franklin? Ah, dang it!
That was an awful
Who
guess.
is it? Who the hell is Charles Inglis? Charles Inglis? Charles freaking Inglis? I've never even heard of that guy.
Yeah,
That's
I
not
wouldn't
fair. Ah! Oh, I hate that. Apparently he's a bishop or something. Anyway, people like Inglis remind us that not everyone in the colonies was all fired up to be an independent nation. In fact, in July of 1775, the Continental Congress sent the Olive Branch petition to King George III, suggesting that Americans were loyal British subjects who wanted reconciliation with the mother country. But then along came Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense. Why couldn't that have been the mystery document? Common Sense appeared in January of 1776, and it was like the Harry Potter of its time, only with liberty instead of wizard school. Written in relatively straightforward English, the pamphlet contains many powerful rhetorical arguments, like, of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. Others were just common sense, like this nugget. There is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. Pow! Also, there's the beautiful sentiment, the weapon we have is love. Oh, that's from Harry Potter? I told you they were similar. Ultimately, Paine's arguments all contributed to the idea that America is somehow special, even exceptional. I mean, talking about independence and freedom, he said, the cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. That's powerful stuff, and Paine's pamphlet sold 150,000 copies, and it was extremely widely read. By the way, he still managed to die penniless, and only 8 people attended his funeral because of his vitriolic ridicule of Christianity. But anyway, America eventually declared independence for many reasons, but Paine's persuasive arguments were one important reason. And it marks a moment when the pen truly was, if not more powerful, then at least more important than the sword. I mean, within 6 months of the publication of Common Sense, the Second Continental Congress had declared independence and signed one of the most important documents in the history of the world, which is where we'll pick up next week. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself.
We're chugging along.
You've been duped, fellas. You're paying way too much money for your activewear. It's time for a change. And that change is fair.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History. There are 2 kinds of revolutions. Those where things do change, and those where things don't change. Like, not to get all Crash Course mathematics on you or anything, but a revolution is a 360-degree turn, which leaves you back where you started. That's what happened with the French Revolution. Basically, they just exchanged a bourbon for a Bonaparte. What? I don't have to say it all Frenchy. This is American history. And shut up, French people, about how if it weren't for your support in the American Revolution, this would be the history of southern Canada. But other revolutions, like the Industrial Revolution, actually changed things. So, which was the American Revolution? Well, little of column A, little of column B. Mr. Green! Yeah, we went from a bunch of rich white guys running the show all the way to a bunch of rich white guys running the show. You're not wrong, me from the past, but the 1700s were a pretty good century for rich white guys everywhere. I mean, they were running the show in Holland and Portugal and Spain, but only the United States became the country that invented baseball, the Model T, and competitive eating. So you're right, me from the past, but even if the U.S. didn't live up to its rhetoric, that rhetoric was still powerful. And in the end, whether you care more about ideas or policy defines whether you think the American Revolution really was revolutionary. Alright, let's start with the War for Independence. If you've been watching Crash Course, you'll know that we're not big on gratuitous war details, but we're obligated to tell you something about it. The main strategy of the British in the Revolutionary War was to capture all the cities and force the colonists to surrender. And the first part of that strategy pretty much worked. They captured Boston and New York and Charleston, but all the colonists had to do was not quit. I mean, they had home field advantage, knowledge of the terrain, easier supply lines, and Mr. Creepy Eyes down here. So while the British took the cities, the Americans, or Continentals, held onto the countryside. The most famous battle of the war was probably the Battle of Trenton, where Washington was like, I'm gonna cross the Delaware on Christmas morning. He had a funny voice. Everybody knows he had a funny voice. It's famous. That's a made-up fact. Don't put it on your AP tests. What do I know about Washington? Well, I know he had a funny voice. Washington surprised a bunch of Hessians, which was a pretty impressive victory, especially since he'd just come off a string of defeats. But he wasn't able to turn it into an all-out rout and ended up having to spend a miserable winter in Valley Forge. But remember, generals always get to eat. But the most important battle, at least in the north, was not Trenton, but Saratoga. This was a major defeat for the British, and while it's often put forth as an example of the superiority of the continental fighting man, the British mostly lost because of terrible generaling. The French would eventually bankrupt themselves helping us, which would lead to their own revolution. As thanks, we named our most important food after them. In the south, the country-city trend continued, with the British taking Charleston, but then continuing to lose smaller-scale battles and be harassed by guerrilla-style tactics. The key battle of the war in the south, because it was the one where the British surrendered, was at Yorktown in 1781. Lord Cornwallis made the brilliant tactical decision to station his troops on a peninsula surrounded on three sides by water filled with French ships, and the British lost the war. So what did this all mean for actual people? Well, Americans like to think that we all pitched in together and got rid of British tyranny and lived happily ever after. Also that the Continental Army was the bravest, most loyal, and most effective fighting force in human history thanks to the leadership of George Washington. But actually, well, yeah, let's go to the thought bubble. Morale among Continental soldiers was often pretty low. Rations were poor and soldiers went unpaid. As Joseph Plum Martin, a soldier from Connecticut, wrote, they felt they were starving in detail for an ungrateful people who did not care what became of us. And many other colonists didn't fight for independence, they fought with the British. Others were pacifists, like the Quakers, who often had their property confiscated when they refused to fight. And in colonial America, of course, losing property also meant losing rights. And for slaves, the so-called fight for freedom was very different than it was for Continental soldiers, because loyalty to Britain in the war could mean freedom. In 1775, British Governor Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation that granted freedom to any slave who deserted his master and fought for the British. Something like 5,000 slaves took him up on the offer. And in addition, many slaves saw the revolution as a chance to escape. Boston King left a cruel master and later wrote, I determined to go to Charlestown and throw myself into the hands of the English. They received me readily, and I began to feel the happiness of liberty, of which I knew nothing before. 100,000 slaves are estimated to have fled to the British. Now, many slaves were returned to their masters, but more than 15,000 left the U.S. when the British did. And it's worth remembering that the British Empire abolished slavery in all of its territory by 1843, and without a civil war. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Native Americans were also profoundly affected by the Revolutionary War. Generally, they wanted to stay out of it, and the colonists mostly wanted them to remain neutral too. Like the Continental Congress was eager to remind the Iroquois of their history of neutrality, writing, this is a family quarrel between us and Old England. You Indians are not concerned in it. We don't wish you to take up the hatchet against the king's troops. We desire you to remain at home and not join on either side, but keep the hatchet buried deep. Right, well, many of the Iroquois fought for the British anyway. The Oneidas joined the Patriots fighting against the Iroquois. Sometimes there were divisions within tribes themselves. Like with the Cherokees, younger chiefs tended to side with the British, older ones with the Americans. And it should be mentioned that, unsurprisingly, American troops were particularly brutal to American Indians who fought for the British, burning their villages and enslaving prisoners contrary to the accepted rules of war. And if the American Revolution was really about, as Thomas Jefferson would have it, the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then the Indians were definitely the losers because they didn't get any of those rights. So we know slaves and Native Americans didn't get much out of the Revolutionary War. How did it go for women? Yeah, not great. Some colonial women fought in the war. Deborah Sampson dressed as a man and fought at several battles, once even pulling a bullet out of her own leg. But women didn't get much out of the Revolution. They were basically still considered wards of their husbands, or if they were unmarried, saleable assets of their fathers. However, the idea of Republican motherhood became really important. It held that for the Republic to survive, it was necessary to have a well-educated citizenry. And since women were the primary educators, they themselves needed to be educated so they could, to quote founding father Benjamin Rush, instruct their sons in the principles of liberty and government. But not vote or own property. So the war didn't end slavery, it didn't much change the roles of women, and it didn't displace the elite land-owning, pasty, white guy leadership of America. So what was revolutionary? Well, the ideas, a lot of which are summed up in a single sentence of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So when the colonies became states, they all created constitutions which opened voting to more people. While most states still had property qualifications for voting, the bar was lowered, so there were far more voters than there had been, although they were mostly white and male. But still, another aspect of the American Revolution that was pretty revolutionary was the beginning of true religious freedom. Like with independence, the Church of England ceased to be the Church of America. And some founders, like Thomas Jefferson, were deists, believing that God had created the world, but then stepped away to create other universes or try to build a boulder too big for him to lift. Jefferson called for a wall of separation between church and state that's best embodied in the bill for establishing religious freedom in Virginia, which Jefferson was so proud of that he had it mentioned on his tombstone. And the American Revolution profoundly changed the economy too. All these new ideas of liberty led to a decline in apprenticeship and indentured servitude, and immediately after the war you began to see the split between the North with its reliance on paid labor and the South with its reliance on slavery. Slavery was actually on the decline in the South until Eli Whitney went and invented the cotton gin in 1793, which A, made it possible to turn a profit growing inferior American cotton, and B, reinvigorated slavery. Yay, innovation! Oh no, it's time for the mystery document. The rules are simple. Mystery document, get it wrong. Shock pen, get it right. Woo! An equality of property, constantly operating to destroy combinations of powerful families, is the very soul of a republic. While this continues, the people will inevitably possess both power and freedom. When this is lost, power departs, liberty expires, and a commonwealth will inevitably assume some other form. Let the people have property, and they will have power. A power that will forever be exerted to prevent a restriction of the press and the abolition of trial by jury or the abridgment of any other privilege. Stan, why did you put communism in my mystery document? Alright, so we got a fan of wealth distribution, but it isn't Marx because A, he's not American, B, he wasn't born. There were a bunch of far-left hippies in early America with their hemp growing and their liberty espousing. Oh, I hate the shock pen. Alright, I'm gonna guess that it is noted lexicographer Noah Webster. Yes! 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 Yes!
Good for John.
Yes! Nailed it! Yes! Stan, that was the best one ever. That was my biggest victory to date. So it's worth remembering that some early Americans proposed a vision of liberty that sprung out of the idea of equality of property, which is very different from the way we imagine liberty today. But ideas of liberty, as diverse as they were, are really at the heart of what makes the American Revolution revolutionary. And that brings us back to slavery. The most common complaint among American high school students is that the revolution was deeply hypocritical. I mean, how could this guy write that all men were created equal when he himself held slaves and had kids with one of them? And even crazier, American colonists often referred to themselves as slaves because they were denied the right to have a vote in Parliament about their taxation. Now, some people recognize that it was a smidge hypocritical to claim to be enslaved by British taxation, while they themselves were actually enslaving people. But very few made the leap to say that liberty should mean freedom for the slaves. One exception was James Otis of Massachusetts, who wrote concerning America's slaves that unless they were free, there could be no liberty. What man is or ever was born free?
Good.
Every man is not. But most of the founders, including this guy and this guy, were the cream of the colonial elites, and so they held slaves and made arguments against abolition. Like many historians now argue that Jefferson was trying to condemn slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but without slavery, he wouldn't have had his amazing life. I mean, if he'd been working, he couldn't have designed Monticello or stolen all those ideas from John Locke. And speaking of Locke, Locke equated liberty with property, and a revolution based on securing property against tyranny couldn't very well turn slaves who, after all, were considered property. I mean, Jefferson once calculated that his slaves gave him a better financial return than his real estate investments. That being said, there were many and frequent protests against slavery. The most vociferous protesters were often African Americans, and in the northern states at least, their pleas were heard. Between 1777 and 1804, all states north of Maryland got rid of slavery, although most did so at a very slow pace and were careful not to deprive slave owners of the value of their property. Like, as late as 1830, there were still about 3,500 slaves in the North, and on the eve of the Civil War, there were still 18 in New Jersey. New Jersey! So the number of free people of color in the U.S. skyrocketed. There were fewer than 10,000 in 1776. By 1810, there were nearly 200,000 free black Americans. So in the end, real change came, as it usually does, not through a revolutionary event, but through a revolutionary process. To me, the really novel idea that emerged from the American Revolution was of American equality. Now, obviously, this was and remains a vastly unequal social order, but I'm talking about the kind of equality that Gordon Wood described in his famous book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. The idea that no one American is inherently better than any other. Prior to the Revolution, and certainly in Europe, there were definite classes of superior people, usually determined by birth. I mean, people knew their place and they were expected to be deferential to their betters. But all that talk of freedom and inalienable rights introduced the idea that birth wasn't destiny and that all people should be treated with respect. And the idea that no one should be denied the opportunity to succeed because of who their parents were catalyzed change not just in America, but around the world. And while the U.S. no longer leads in equality of opportunity, that early American idea that we are all equal in our capacity to reason and to work became the foundation not just for the American Revolution, but for many others that would come afterward. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller, edited by Stan and Mark Olson. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson. The script...
Ooh.
Don't overpay for Adidas. WikiBuy can save you money. It's a browser extension that automatically applies coupon codes to your...
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about the United States Constitution. And in doing so, we're going to explore how the American style of government became the envy of the entire world, so much so that everyone else copied us. What's that, Stan? We're not going to talk about other countries stealing our form of government because no other country stole our form of government? That doesn't seem possible, Stan. No, Stan, not the Libertage. Cue the intro. So today we're going to learn why the green areas of not America didn't copy us. Alright, so as Americans may dimly remember from history classes, the constitutional system we've been living under since 1788, the year of the first presidential election, was not the original American government. The first government set up by the Continental Congress was called the Articles of Confederation, and it was, in a word, bad. In 2 words, it was not good, which is why it only lasted 10 years. The problem with the Confederation is that it wasn't so much a framework for a national government as it was a firm league of friendship, which unfortunately only sounds like a team of Care Bear superheroes. The Articles set up a government that consisted of a one-house body of delegates, with each state having a single vote, who, acting collectively, could make decisions on certain issues that affected all the states. There was no president and no judiciary. You can try to tell me that John Hanson, the president of the Congress, was the first American president, but it's just not true. Any decision required 9 of the 13 congressional votes, which pretty much guaranteed that no decisions would ever be made. Ah, supermajorities, always so efficient. But besides the 2/3 requirement, the Congress was very limited in what it could actually do. The government could declare war, conduct foreign affairs, and make treaties. Basically the stuff you need to do to go to war with England. It could coin money, but it couldn't collect taxes. That was left to the states. So if you needed money to, say, go to war with Britain, you had to ask the states politely. The Articles could be amended, but that required a unanimous vote, so 0 amendments were ever passed. The government was deliberately weak, which followed logically from Americans' fear of tyrannical governments taxing them and quartering soldiers in their houses and so on. But here's the thing, weak government is like non-alcoholic beer. It's useless. That said, the Articles government did accomplish a couple things. First, it won the war, so yay! Unless you were a slave or a Native American, in which case, probable boo. Second, the government developed rules for dealing with one of the most persistent problems facing the new nation. Ohio, which was called the Northwest, presumably because it is north and west of Virginia. Getting control of the land meant taking it from the Indians who were living there, and the Articles government was empowered to make treaties, which it did. Crash Course World History fans will remember the Athenians telling the Melians that the strong do as they can and the weak suffer what they must, and the Americans definitely went to the Athenian school of treaty making. Through treaties signed at Fort Stanwix and Fort McIntosh, the Indians surrendered land north of the Ohio River. The biggest accomplishment of the Articles government was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which set up a process to create 5 new states between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. 2 things to know about this. First, it acknowledged that American Indians had a claim to the land and that they had to be treated better if settlers wanted to avoid violence. And second, Stan, can I get the foreshadowing filter? Yes, perfect. The ordinance outlawed slavery in all 5 of the new states. Still, the Articles government was a complete disaster for exactly one reason: it could not collect taxes. Both the national government and the individual states had racked up massive debt to pay for the war, and their main source of revenue became tariffs, but because Congress couldn't impose them, states had to do it individually. And this made international trade a total nightmare, a fact worsened by the British being kind of cranky about us winning the war and therefore unwilling to trade with us. In 1786 and 1787, the problem got so bad in Massachusetts that farmers rose up and closed the courts to prevent them from foreclosing upon their debt-encumbered farm. This was called Shays' Rebellion after Revolutionary War veteran and indebted farmer Daniel Shays. The uprising was quelled by the state militia, but for many, this was the sign that the Articles government, which couldn't deal with the crisis at all, had to go. But not for everyone. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, was a fan of Shays' Rebellion. A little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Which is all fine and good, I mean, unless you're the bleeding patriots or tyrants. But to most elites, Shays' Rebellion showed that too much democratic liberty among the lower classes could threaten private property. Also, people who held government bonds were nervous because without tax revenue, they were unlikely to get paid back. And when rich people feel like something has to be done, something is usually done. Let's go to the thought bubble. The first attempt to do something was a meeting in Annapolis in 1786 aimed at better regulating international trade. Only 6 states sent delegates, but they agreed to meet the next year in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. The delegates who met in Philly the next year had a funny definition of revision, though. Rather than make tweaks to the Articles, they wrote a new charter of government, the Constitution, which is, with some significant alterations, the same one that Americans live under and argue about today. Despite what some seem to believe, the 55 men who met in Philadelphia and hammered out a new form of government were not gods, but they were far from ordinary, especially for the time. Most were wealthy, some very much so. More than half had college educations, which was super rare since 0.001% of Americans attended college at the time. About 40% had served in the army during the war. But one thing they all shared was a desire for a stronger national government. The delegates agreed on many things. The government should have executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and should be Republican with representatives rather than direct democracy. But the devil appeared in the details. Alexander Hamilton, probably the biggest proponent of very strong government, wanted the president and senate to serve life terms, for example. That idea went nowhere because the overarching concern of almost all the delegates was to create a government that would protect against both tyranny by the government itself and tyranny by the people. They didn't want too much government, but they also didn't want too much democracy, which is why our presidents are still technically elected not directly by regular people, but by 538 members of the Electoral College. This system is so Byzantine and strange that when American politicians speak of spreading democracy through the world, they never actually advocate for American-style elections. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Yes, I know, you have fantastic elections in Canada. Yeah, right, okay, all that too. I get it. Okay, it's U.S. history, Thought Bubble. So conflicts between competing interests arose quickly at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the first being between states with big populations and those with small populations. Large states supported James Madison's Virginia plan, which called for a 2-house legislature with representation in both proportional to a state's population, and smaller states, fearing that the big boys would dominate, rallied behind the New Jersey plan. This called for a single legislative house with equal representation for each state, as with the Articles of Confederation. But of course, coming from New Jersey, it had no chance of succeeding, and sure enough, it didn't. Instead, we got the Great Compromise, brokered by Connecticut's Roger Sherman, which gave us 2 houses. A House of Representatives with representation proportional to each state's population, and a Senate with 2 members from each state. House members, also called congressmen, served 2-year terms, while senators served 6-year terms, with 1/3 of them being up for election in every 2-year cycle. The House was designed to be responsive to the people, while the Senate was created to never pass anything, and it was so masterfully designed that it still works to this day. However, this solution created another problem: who should be counted in terms of representation? Slaveholding states wanted slaves to count toward their population, even though of course they could not vote because they were property. States with few slaves argued that slaves shouldn't be counted as people because, just to be clear, none of these dudes were not racist. This issue was solved with the notorious 3/5 compromise. For the purpose of determining the population, the total number of white people plus 3/5 the population of other persons, the word slave was never used, would be the basis for for the calculation.
So,
Yeah, that's still in the Constitution. The Constitution also contains a fugitive slave clause requiring any escaped slave to be returned to their master. And this meant that a slave couldn't escape slavery by moving to a state where slavery was outlawed, which meant that on some level, some states couldn't enforce their own laws. Spoiler alert, this becomes problematic. But except for the tyranny of slavery, the framers really hated tyranny. To avoid tyranny of the government, the Constitution embraced two principles: separation of powers and federalism. The government was divided into three branches: legislative, executive, and judiciary. And the Constitution incorporated checks and balances. Each branch can check the power of the others. The legislature can make laws, but the president can veto those laws. The judiciary can declare laws void too, but that's a power they had to grant themselves. You won't find it in the Constitution, I promise. You can look for it. And federalism is the idea that governmental authority rests both in the national and the state governments. As an American, I am a citizen both of the United States and of the state of Indiana. And the national government, the one set up by the Constitution, is supposed to be limited in scope to certain enumerated powers. Most other powers, especially the protection of health, safety, and morals, are left to the states. But the Constitution also seeks to protect against the radicalism that too much democracy can bring. The mostly rich framers worried that the people, many of whom were poor and indebted, might vote in Congress people or, God forbid, a president in favor of, redistribution of property. To hedge against this, senators were elected by the states, usually by state legislatures, and they were supposed to be leading citizen types. You know, the kind of good Americans who take bribes and have adulterous affairs in airport bathrooms and patronize prostitutes and shoot Alexander Hamilton. Anyway, the other hedge against too much democracy is the aforementioned Electoral College, which many Americans hate because it has the potential to elect a president who did not win the popular vote. But that's kind of the point. The electors were supposed to be prominent, educated men of property who were better able to elect a president than, the rabble. But the Constitution of the United States is a really impressive document, especially when you consider its longevity. I mean, as Crash Course World History fans will remember, the nation-state is pretty new on the historical scene, and the United States established by the Constitution is actually one of the oldest ones. But the Constitution would be meaningless if it hadn't been ratified, which it was, but not without a fight that helped clarify America's political ideology. 9 out of the 13 states were required to ratify the Constitution, and special conventions called for the purpose. In order to convince the delegates to vote for it, 3 of the framers, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, wrote a series of 85 essays that together are known as the Federalist Papers. Taken together, they're a powerful and ultimately persuasive argument for why a strong national government is necessary and ultimately not a threat to people's liberty. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. If I name the author of the mystery document, shock as in surprise. If I don't, shock as in Alright, Stan, let's see what we got here. If circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people while there is a large body of citizens, little, if at all, inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens. This appears to me the only substitute that can be devised for a standing army and the best possible security against it, if it should exist. Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton. Yes! Too easy, Stan, although I appreciate the opportunity for a rant. The whole idea of the Second Amendment was that the people could protect themselves from a standing army by being equally well armed, which these days would mean not that citizens should have the right to buy assault rifles, but that they should have the right to buy, unmanned drones and arguably suitcase nukes. And by the way, in the Constitution, this is not listed as a privilege, it is listed as a right. And as a right, if I can't afford my own Predator drone, I guess the government should buy one for me. It's almost as if Alexander Hamilton had no way of knowing that weaponry would one day advance past the musket. P.S. You know how Alexander Hamilton died? Gunshot! Sorry, I had to. I am on a roll. So it would be easy to ignore the people who opposed the Constitution because, they lost. But some of the ideas of these so-called anti-federalists were particularly powerful, and they deserve a bit of attention. Anti-federalists, unlike the mostly wealthy federalists, were usually supported by common people, small farmers who weren't as involved in commercial activity. They saw less need for a strong national government that would foster trade and protect creditors, and the anti-federalists were very afraid of a strong government, especially one dominated by the wealthy. Writers like James Winthrop held that a large group of United States would be like an empire, and that no extensive empire can be governed upon republican principles. As evidence, he could point to Britain, or all the way back to Rome. Smaller, more local governments are more responsive to the people and better able to protect their rights. To the anti-federalists, that meant state governments. And while ultimately the Federalists won out and the Constitution was ratified, the issue of how large government should be did not go away. So the Constitution was really only a starting point. It's a vague document, and the details would be worked out in the political process, and then on the battlefield. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.
Ooh,
Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The show is written by...
Oh, U.S. politics. This one will be good because I have my AP Gov
Alright,
exam.
April 13th is when it came in.
That's my name, Matthew Stillman, right there. So I don't know if you can.
Hi, I'm John
excited
Green.
for
This
this
is
one.
Crash Course U.S. History, and now that we have a Constitution, it's actually United States history. Today we're going to look at the birth of America's pastime. Nope, Stan, not baseball, not football, not eating. I mean politics, which in America has been adversarial since its very beginnings, despite what the founders wanted.
Started to hate that song.
We looked at the first big conflict in American politics last week, Constitution or Articles of Confederation. I hope that I convinced you that we made the correct choice, but regardless, we made it. The Constitution passed. But immediately following the passage of the Constitution, a pretty fundamental conflict came up. What kind of country should we be? Mr. Green, the U.S. is supposed to...
Sorry, I don't know what happened.
be the policeman of the world and keep all the people in the green parts of not America from hurting themselves. Oh, me from the past. We don't get into that stuff until 1823. So one vision of America was put forward by Alexander Hamilton, who'd served in the war as Washington's top aide and would go on to be his first Secretary of the Treasury and probably would have been president himself had he not been born in the British West Indies. Hamilton had a strong personality and, as you can see, the beautiful wavy hair of a Caribbean god, and he had very definite ideas about what he wanted the future of America to look like. First, Hamilton wanted the country to be mercantile, which means that he believed that we should be deeply involved in world trade. Second, he wanted the U.S. to be a manufacturing powerhouse. We wouldn't just buy and sell stuff, we would make it too. He even invested in a plan to make Paterson, New Jersey a manufacturing hub, which of course ultimately failed because New Jersey. But to make a manufacturing giant, he needed a strong government that could build infrastructure and protect patents, but you already knew that he was in favor of a strong government because of course he wrote so many of the Federalist Papers. Hamilton also envisioned an America that was governed primarily by the elite. His party, which came to be known as the Federalist Party, would be the one of the rich, the able, and the well-born. I mean, just think, if the Federalist Party had survived, we might have had a bunch of, Bushes and Kennedys as presidents. Hamilton also wanted America to be firmly affiliated with Great Britain, which isn't surprising given his passion for elitism and trade. But there was an opposing view of what America should look like, and it's most associated with Thomas Jefferson. Let's go to the thought bubble. Jefferson wanted an America that was predominantly agrarian, with most people being small-scale, subsistence-level farmers. Maybe they would produce a little surplus for local markets, but certainly not for international consumers. There would be no international trade. And he didn't want manufacturing either. This small-scale local economy could best be served by a small-scale local government. It's not a surprise to find that Jefferson's sympathies lay with the anti-federalists, even though he benefited from the new Constitution a little bit since, he eventually got to be president and everything. Unlike the elitist Hamilton, Jefferson was an avowed Democrat, which meant that he distrusted concentrated power and privilege and believed that the masses could basically govern themselves. To him, government and concentrated economic power were greater threats to liberty than a tyrannical majority. Jefferson was a big fan of the French, and not only because he spent a fair amount of time in Paris as our ambassador there, he also liked the French because they fought with us in the War of Independence against the British, and because after 1789 he liked the way the French treated their aristocrats, that is, brutally. In general, Jefferson and his partisans, who called themselves Republicans, although some current textbooks call them Democratic Republicans just to make things incredibly confusing, preferred France just as the Hamiltonians preferred Britain. And this was a bit of a problem, because France and England were pretty much constantly at war between 1740 and 1815. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So linked to these imagined Americas were the questions of how democratic we should be and how much free speech we should have. Jefferson and the Republicans wanted more democracy and more free speech. Well, sort of. I mean, during Washington's presidency, Democratic-Republican societies sprang up, the first opposition political parties, and in 1794, the Democratic-Republican Society of Pennsylvania published an address which made the point that, quote, freedom of thought and a free communication of opinions by speech or through the medium of the press are the safeguards of our liberties. The Federalists, on the other hand, saw too much free speech and democracy as a threat. And from this, it sounds like the Republicans were better Democrats, but it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, for one thing, many Republicans, including Thomas Jefferson, were slaveholders, and slavery is kind of the opposite of democracy. And for another, many were supporters of the French Revolution, and supporting the French Revolution after 1793 is pretty problematic. Because, as you'll remember from Crash Course World History, Robespierre was guillotining everyone up until the point where he himself was guillotined. Okay, so in the first real American presidential election, there weren't any political parties. There wasn't even a campaign. The election was uncontested, and George Washington won. He didn't even have to run for office. He stood for it. Washington's presidency is important for a number of precedents that he set, including the notion that a president should only serve 2 terms, and the idea that even if he was a general, the president should wear civilian clothing, but he wasn't the real policy brains. Hamilton was. Washington probably wouldn't have called himself a Federalist, but he backed Hamilton's plan for a stronger nation. And to that end, Hamilton began the great American tradition of having a 5-point plan. Point 1, establish the nation's credit worthiness. Hamilton realized that if the new nation wanted to be taken seriously, it had to pay off its debts, most of which had come during the war. And to do this, Hamilton proposed that the U.S. government assume the debts that the states had amassed. Point 2, create a national debt. That's something you don't hear politicians say these days. Hamilton wanted to create new interest-bearing bonds, hoping to give the rich people a stake in our nation's success. Point 3, create a Bank of the United States. This bank would be private, and it would turn a profit for its shareholders, but it would hold public funds and issue notes that would circulate as currency, and the bank would definitely be needed to house all the money that was expected to be raised from point 4, a whiskey tax. Then, as now, Americans liked to drink, and one sure way to raise money was to set an excise tax on whiskey, which might reduce drinking on the margins or cause people to switch to beer, but what it would definitely do is hurt small farmers, who found the most profitable use of their grain was to distill it into sweet, sweet whiskey. So the whiskey tax really upset small farmers, as we will see in a moment. Point 5, encourage domestic industrial manufacturing by imposing a tariff. For those of you who think the U.S. was founded on free trade principles, think again. Now, you'll remember that the Republicans wanted an agrarian republic with freer trade, so they disliked pretty much all of Hamilton's plan. They also argued that none of this was in the Constitution, and they were right. This position of expecting government to be limited by the text of the Constitution came to be known as strict construction. But the Republicans lacked a 5-point plan of their own, so their only hope of success was to shave Hamilton's 5-point plan down to 4 points, which is what they did. In 1790, Republicans, many of whom were Southerners like Jefferson, struck a bargain. They agreed to points 1 through 4 of Hamilton's plan in exchange for a permanent capital on the Potomac in the South, as opposed to the first 2 temporary capitals of the U.S. in New York and Philadelphia. So the Hamiltonian economy won out for a while. Probably the most immediately controversial aspect of Hamilton's plan was the whiskey tax, and not just because people loved to drink, but also because farmers loved to turn their rye into whiskey into profits. In 1794, Western Pennsylvania farmers even took up arms to protest the tax, and that clearly could not stand. Washington actually led, at least for part of the way, a force of 13,000 men to put down this whiskey rebellion, becoming the only sitting president to lead troops in the field, and America continued to tax booze as it does to this day. On the subject of foreign affairs, there was much more agreement. Just kidding. Hamilton wanted the U.S. to have close ties to Britain for commercial reasons, but Britain was perpetually at war with France, with whom the U.S. technically had a perpetual alliance. You know, because they helped us win the American Revolution, they gave us the Statue of Liberty and Marion Cotillard, etc. And the French Revolution made things even more complicated because Republicans liked it, but Federalists, being somewhat conservative and elitist, were afraid of it. This was especially true when French emissary Citizen Genet showed up in 1793 and started hiring American ships to attack British ones. Britain, in response, began impressing American sailors, which sounds fun, but it isn't. It doesn't mean the British sailors wowed Americans with their awesome mermaid tattoos. It means they kidnapped them and forced them to serve in the British Navy. Washington dispatched Secretary of State John Jay to deal with the impressment issue, and he negotiated the boringly named Jay Treaty, which improved trade relations between the U.S. and Britain and said absolutely nothing about impressment or American shipping rights. For the rest of his term, Washington just tried to ignore the problem, thereby inaugurating another presidential tradition, kicking big foreign policy problems down the line for future presidents. By the end of his presidency, George Washington was somewhat disillusioned by politics. His famous call for unity said that with slight shades of difference, you Americans have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. Washington warned against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally, saying that it agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection, it opens the door to foreign influence and corruption. Still, by the time the diminutive John Adams took over as the second president, Americans had already divided themselves into two groups: elitist Federalists and Republicans, who stood for freedom and equality and... Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document. If I am right, I do not get shocked. If I am wrong, I do get shocked. Alright, let's give it a go. Yes, ye lordy, ye haughty sex, our souls are by nature equal to yours. The same breath of God animates, enlivens, and invigorates us. Were we to grant that animal strength proved anything, taking into consideration the accustomed impartiality of nature, we should be induced to imagine that she had invested the female mind with superior strength as an equivalent for the bodily powers of man. But waiving this, however palpable advantage, for equality only we wish to contend. So the author of the mystery document is a badass woman. So we have here an argument, and a bit of a snarky one, for equality between men and women. Alright, I can do this. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is too young, also probably not funny enough. Stan, my official guess is Sarah Grimke.
Dang it!
Judith Sargent Murray. Well, you know, as part of the patriarchy, I probably deserve this anyway. So Judith Sargent Murray reminds us that once unleashed, ideas like liberty and equality spread to places where neither the male Federalists nor the male Republicans wanted them to go. But back to Adams. His election in 1796 exposed a big flaw in our electoral system. Because the vice presidency went to whomever had the second highest total number of electoral votes, and that person happened to be Thomas Jefferson, we ended up in a situation where the president and the vice president were on opposite sides of the political spectrum, which was not good. So they changed the Constitution, but not until after the next election, which featured another screw-up. We are awesome at this! Side note, the Electoral College system would continue to misrepresent the will of the American voters, most notably in 1876, 1888, and 2000, but also in every election! Domestically, Adams continued Hamilton's policy, but Adams' presidency is best known for foreign problems. Especially the way Adams' administration totally overreacted to problems with France. Because we were trying to maintain good commercial relationships with England, and England was perpetually at war with France, France ended up in a quasi-war with the United States despite our eternal alliance. They disrupted our shipping, we felt nervous about their increasingly violent revolution, and then, after 3 French emissaries tried to extort a bribe from the US government as part of negotiations, the so-called XYZ affair, because we didn't want to give the names of these bribe-seeking French scoundrels, the American public turned against France somewhat hysterically, as it will. Taking advantage of the hysteria, Adams pushed through the Alien and Sedition Act. The Alien Act lengthened the period of time it took to become a citizen, and the Sedition Act made it a crime to criticize the government. Among the more famous people prosecuted under the Sedition Act was Matthew Lyon, a congressman from Vermont who was jailed for saying that John Adams was maybe not the best president ever. And while in jail, Lyon won re-election to Congress, which might indicate just how popular this law wasn't. It was so unpopular that Virginia and Kentucky's legislatures passed resolutions against it, claiming that it violated Americans' liberties and that state legislatures had the power to overturn or nullify any federal law that they found to violate the Constitution. This whole business of nullification in states' rights, it will return. The Alien and Sedition Acts were allowed to lapse under Jefferson, and they didn't lead to widespread arrests of everyone who called Adams a tyrant or expressed admiration for the French Revolution, and even though they weren't popular, they didn't doom the Federalist Party either, even though no Federalist was elected president after Adams. But the Alien and Sedition Acts and the response to them from Virginia and Kentucky are important because they show us how unsettled American politics were in the first decade of this country's existence. Even something as basic as freedom of speech was up for grabs as America tried to figure out what kind of country it was going to be. That's important to think about when studying American history, but it's also important to think about when looking at new democracies. You might think that Thomas Jefferson winning the presidential election of 1800 settled all this stuff, but it wasn't so simple. It never is, really. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to discuss Thomas Jefferson. We're going to learn about how America became a thriving nation of small, independent farmers, eschewing manufacturing and world trade, and becoming the richest and most powerful nation in the world in the 19th century, all thanks to the vision of Thomas Jefferson, the greatest and most intellectual... consistent founding father who founded the University of Virginia and grew 20 varieties of peas at Monticello. Me from the past, get to your desk. In a stunning turn of events, me from the past is an idiot, and Jefferson is more complicated than that. So in 1800, Thomas Jefferson, pictured here, this is the third time that we've featured Thomas Jefferson on the chalkboard, so we had to go a little Warhol on it. Right, so Jefferson, the Republican, ran against John Adams, the Federalist. 1800 was the first election where both parties ran candidates and actually campaigned, and surprisingly, the Federalists' elitist
I didn't click anything.
Strategy of vote for Adams because he's better than you did not work. Now, both parties realized that it was important to coordinate their electoral strategy to make sure that the vice presidential candidate got at least one fewer electoral votes than the presidential candidate. But then the Republican elector who was supposed to throw his vote away forgot to, so there ended up being a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. As per the Constitution, the election went to the House of Representatives, where it took 36 ballots and the intervention of Alexander Hamilton before Jefferson was finally named president. Incidentally, Burr and Hamilton really disliked each other, and not in like the passive-aggressive way that politicians dislike each other these days, but in the 4 years later they would have a duel and Burr killed Hamilton kind of way. A duel which occurred, wait for it, in New Jersey. But anyway, shortly after the election of 1800, the 12th Amendment was passed, making the Electoral College simpler, but not as simple as, say, one person's vote counting as one vote. Anyway, complain about the Electoral College all you want, but without it, we would never have had President Rutherford B. Hayes, and just look at that beard! So Jefferson became president, and his election showed that Americans wanted a more democratic politics, where common people were more free to express their opinions. The Federalists were never really a threat again in presidential politics, and arguably the best thing that John Adams ever did was transfer power in an orderly and honorable way to his rival Jefferson. Jefferson's campaign slogan was Jefferson and liberty, but the liberty in question was severely limited. Only a fraction of white men were allowed to vote, and of course there was no liberty for the slaves. There's a lot of contentious debate on the subject of Jefferson and slavery, but here's my 2 cents, which I should not be allowed to contribute because we should only round to the nearest nickel, which, by the way, features Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson was a racist, and he wrote about black people's inherent inferiority to whites and Native Americans, and the fact that he fathered children with one of his slaves doesn't change that. George Washington freed his slaves upon his death. Well, sort of. They were supposed to be freed upon his wife's death, but living in a house full of people who were waiting for you to die made Martha want to free them while she was still alive. But with few exceptions, Jefferson didn't free his slaves upon his death, and throughout his life he used the sale of slaves to finance his lavish lifestyle. And this leads to 2 big philosophical questions when it comes to history. First, if Jefferson clearly did not think that black people were the intellectual or moral equals of whites and was perfectly comfortable keeping them in bondage, then what does the most important phrase of the Declaration of Independence actually mean? And the second question is even broader. Does it matter if a person of tremendous historical importance had terrible aspects to their character? Does being a bad person diminish your accomplishments? I don't have a great answer for those questions, but I will tell you that no one remembers Richard Nixon for starting the EPA. But this is very important to understand. Slaves were aware of the concept of liberty, and they wanted it. So in addition to an election, 1800 also saw one of the first large-scale slave uprisings. Gabriel's Rebellion was organized by a Richmond, Virginia blacksmith who hoped to seize the capital, kill some of its inhabitants, and hold the rest hostage until his demands for abolition were met. But the plot was discovered before they could carry it out, and Gabriel, along with 25 other slaves, was hanged. But after the rebellion, Virginians, if they didn't know it already, were very aware that slaves wanted and expected liberty. And the response was predictable. Virginia made its laws concerning slaves much harsher. It became illegal for slaves to meet in groups on Sundays unless supervised by whites, and it became much more difficult for whites to legally free their slaves. Oh, it's time for the mystery document?
My least favorite part.
The rules here are simple. Identify the author, no shock. Fail to identify the author, shock. The love of freedom, sir, is an inborn sentiment which the God of nature has planted deep in the heart. Long may it be kept under the arbitrary institutions of society, but at the first favorable moment it springs forth and flourishes with a vigor that defies all check. This celestial spark, which fires the breast of the savage, which glows in that of the philosopher, is not extinguished in the bosom of the slave. It may be buried in the embers, but it still lives, and the breath of knowledge kindles it to flame. Thus we find, sir, there have never been slaves in any country who have not seized the first favorable opportunity to revolt. I mean, from the bit at the beginning about the love of freedom, it seems like it could be Jefferson, but the rest does not seem like Jefferson. Probably wasn't a slave, since they were denied access to education precisely because the breadth of knowledge is so dangerous to the institution of slavery. Oh, this is looking pretty bleak for me, Stan. John Jay? Dang it! Who was it? George Tucker? Who the John C. Calhoun is George Tucker? Is there a person watching this who knew that it was George Tucker? Fine. Apparently, George Tucker was a member of the General Assembly of Virginia, and the mystery document was a description of Gabriel's rebellion that suggested a solution to the inherent problem of rebellious slaves. He argued that we should set up a colony for them in Indian Territory in Georgia, which of course also wouldn't have worked because we were soon to steal that territory. But back to Jefferson. His idea was to make the government smaller, lower taxes, shrink the military, and make it possible for America to become a bucolic, agrarian empire of liberty, rather than an English-style, industrial, mercantile nightmare landscape. So how did he do? Well, really well at first. Jefferson got rid of all the taxes except for the tariff, especially the whiskey tax, and then, when he woke up with a terrible, cheap whiskey-induced hangover, he paid off part of the national debt, he shrunk the army and the navy, and basically made sure that America wouldn't become a centralized, English-style state for at least the next 60 years. Low taxes and small government sounds great, but no navy? That would be tough, especially when we needed ships and marines to fight the Barbary pirates on the shores of Tripoli, who kept capturing our ships in the Mediterranean and enslaving their crews. This is yet another example of how foreign affairs keeps getting in the way of domestic priorities. In this case, the domestic priority of not wanting to spend money on a navy. Also, vitally, Jefferson's presidency really marks the last time in American history when a Republican president didn't want to spend money on the military. Don't get me wrong, Democrats can do it too. I'm looking at you, LBJ. As much as he wanted to get rid of any trace of the Federalists, Jefferson found himself thwarted by that eminently conservative and undemocratic institution, the Supreme Court. Jefferson appointed Republicans to most government positions, but he couldn't do anything about the Supreme Court because they served for life. And since the country was only like 12 years old, they were all still pretty fresh. Most important among them was Chief Justice John Marshall, who happened to be a Federalist. Marshall was Chief Justice basically forever, and is without question the most important figure in the history of the Supreme Court. He wrote a number of key opinions, but none was more important than the 1803 decision in Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison is so important because in that decision, the Supreme Court gave itself the power of judicial review, which allows it to uphold or invalidate federal laws. The court then extended this power to state laws in Fletcher versus Peck, and eventually even to executive actions. Like, we think of the main job of the Supreme Court being to declare laws unconstitutional, but that power isn't anywhere in the Constitution itself. Marbury versus Madison gave the court that power, and without it, the Supreme Court would probably be a footnote in American history. So unlike Marshall, Jefferson and the Republicans were big proponents of strict construction, the idea that the Constitution should be read as literally as possible as a way of limiting the power of the federal government. The problem is, there might be things the government wants to do that the Constitution didn't account for, like, for instance, buying a large tract of land from Napoleon, who, as we remember from Crash Course World History, complicates everything. Let's go to the thought bubble. So yeah, Jefferson basically doubled the size of the U.S. in what came to be known as the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon was eager to sell it because the rebellion in Haiti had soured him on the whole idea of colonies, and also because he needed money. Jefferson wanted to purchase New Orleans because Western farmers were shipping their products through the city, and when he approached France about this, Napoleon was like, hey, how about I sell you this? Jefferson couldn't turn down that deal, so he bought the whole kit and caboodle for $15 million, which is worth about $250 million today. To put that into perspective, a new aircraft carrier costs about $4.5 billion, so he got a good deal. What's the problem with this? Well, nothing if you believe in a powerful government that can do stuff that's not in the Constitution, but if you're a strict constructionist like Jefferson, you have to reconcile this obviously beneficial act with there being no mention in the Constitution of the president being able to purchase land in order to expand the size of the U.S. So laying scruple aside, Jefferson bought Louisiana and then sent Lewis and Clark to explore it, which they did, even going beyond the boundaries of the purchase all the way to the Pacific. And this was so cool that it almost makes us forget that it was kind of unconstitutional and a huge power grab for the president. So the question is, why did he do it? Jefferson's desire to increase the size of the country prompted Federalists to complain that, quote, we are to give money, of which we have too little, for land, of which we already have too much. By doubling the size of the country, Jefferson could ensure that there would be enough land for every white man to have his own small farm, and this, in turn, would ensure that Americans would remain independent and virtuous, because only a small farmer who doesn't have to depend on the market for food or shelter or anything really, well, except slaves, can be truly independent independent, and thus capable of participating in a nation of free men. Thanks, Thought Bubble. And this desire to create a nation of independent farmers producing only primary products helps explain Jefferson's other incredibly controversial policy, the embargo. Jefferson imposed the embargo in order to punish Britain for its practice of impressing American sailors, as well as its blockade of France, with whom Britain was once again, or possibly just still, at war. So basically, Jefferson wanted free trade among nations, and his solution was to get Congress to forbid all American ships from sailing to foreign ports. The theory was that the British were so dependent on American primary products like wood and cotton that if we cut off trade with them, the British would stop impressing American sailors and end their blockade. What's the connection between free trade and Jefferson's agrarian ideal? Well, the idea was that America would trade its primary products for Europe's manufactured goods so that the U.S. wouldn't have to develop any manufacturing capacity of its own. Alas, or perhaps fortunately, this did not work. For one thing, Britain and France were too busy fighting each other even to notice America's embargo. So they just continued blockading and impressing. Also, the embargo devastated the American economy. I mean, exports dropped by 80%. Furthermore, not being able to import European manufactured goods only served to spur American manufacturing. I mean, Jefferson might have wanted Americans to be a bunch of self-sufficient farmers, but Americans wanted European manufactured stuff like teapots and clocks and microwaves. Well, then how did they cook stuff, Stan? And if they couldn't get that stuff from Britain, they would just make it themselves. So in terms of Jefferson's agrarian ideal, the embargo was a massive failure. And lastly, the embargo limited the power of the federal government about as much as crystal meth limits cavities. I mean, imposing the embargo was a colossal use of federal power, and it was also an imposition on people's liberties. The problem the embargo was supposed to solve didn't go away, and as we'll discuss next week, it eventually led to the U.S.'s first declared war. For now, I want to leave you with this. Thomas Jefferson is revered and reviled in almost equal measure in American history. The Declaration of Independence, which he mainly drafted, is a signal achievement delineating some heroic ideas for the founding of the United States, but also embedding some of its crucial shortcomings. And Jefferson's presidency is like that too. He claimed to champion small government, but he enlarged federal power more than Washington or Adams ever did. He imagined an agrarian republic, but his policies led to increased manufacturing. He wanted to foster freedom, but he owned slaves and took land from the Indians. In the end, Jefferson's life and policies encapsulate the best and the worst of us, which is why his presidency is still worth studying closely. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. If you have questions about today's video, please ask them in comments where they'll be answered by our team of historians, and we're also accepting submissions for the Libertage captions. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Oh, that was a fake out. It's going this way.
It's like not letting me in.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course US. We say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Oh, that was a fake out. It's going this way.
Alright, I hope that worked. I'm getting tired. I could do this more, but it's not worth it. It's just a small part of life, so it's only one person watching. I think I'm going to end it, but for those of you who watched, and if you're watching after, I don't know if you can see this after, thanks for coming along on the ride. See if I can make myself bigger. Ooh, there we go. I'm trying to, okay. Okay, there we go. This was interesting. Maybe I'll watch the next 10 tomorrow or something. I don't know. Or I should watch a subject that I'm studying, like U.S. politics and government. That would probably be smart. Well, thanks. 3 people on there. I don't know if they're watching the end, but thank you for coming along on the ride. It's pretty fun. 2 hours. I don't think I could do this for another 10 hours. I could. On a marathon, done a lot, but I'm just like not in the mood right now. Especially since this camera is my phone, so I can't like check my phone. Yeah, sorry it wasn't longer. Sorry I didn't do the whole thing. I'll edit the title, say 1 through 10. Alright, I think that's going to do it. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you maybe on the next one. Peace out, history nerds. That was so weird and corny. Now, how do I stop this? Let's see if I can do it. End stream. Okay. Bye.